Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story, your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes, relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. The day I stumbled back into Dreadfall Shore began like any other. I had just finished setting up my new gaming rig, a much-needed upgrade after my ancient laptop finally gave up the ghost. As I was scrolling through my game library, deciding what to install, my eyes landed on a title I hadn't thought about in years. Dreadfall Shore. The name hit me like a wave of nostalgia. Back in 2009, when I was a high school sophomore, this game was all my friends and I could talk about. It wasn't like the other games we played. Dreadfall Shore had this unique hook that kept us coming back night after night. It was a multiplayer survival horror game with a twist. 3 players worked together as survivors stranded in a dark and foggy cove, while a 4th player assumed the role of the killer, hunting them down. What set the game apart was its atmosphere. The cove felt alive, with its rotting shipwrecks, thick mist rolling off the water, and the ominous well in the center of the map. The killer could be anyone, a grim reaper, a shadowy fisherman, or, most memorably, a character called the Watcher. The survivors, on the other hand, had to sabotage lights, set traps, and work together to escape the killer's grasp. If you got caught, it wasn't over for you. Your teammates could still save you, but it came at great risk. It was intense, unpredictable, and downright terrifying. And for a solid month, my friends and I were hooked. Sarah, Mike, and I would rush home from school every day, jump into our group chat, and play match after match. Sarah always picked the medic character, while Mike played as the tech-savvy survivor who could disable traps. I alternated between a fisherman character named Sturgis and when I played as the killer, the Watcher. But then the game just disappeared. There were rumors about legal issues between the developers and their publishers, something about a breach of contract and the developers releasing the game too early. One day, without warning, Dreadfall Shore was pulled from digital stores. The forums went quiet, updates stopped, and just like that, the game faded into obscurity. We moved on to other games, other obsessions, and eventually, other lives. Yet here it was, sitting in my library like a ghost from the past. I couldn't help but wonder, why hadn't I uninstalled it? Curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on the game, half expecting it not to work. To my surprise, it launched without a hitch. The familiar title screen appeared, with its dark, stormy cove and the chilling music that always gave me goosebumps. A wave of nostalgia washed over me as I navigated the menu, but something felt off. For one, the menu looked different. It was simpler, stripped down, as if parts of it were missing. The options for choosing your character were gone, leaving only a single button: Join Match. The vibrant background music I remembered had been replaced with an eerie, low hum. Still, I clicked Join Match. A message popped up, searching for players. I sat back in my chair, waiting. I didn't expect to actually find a match. After all, it had been over a decade since the game's release. But to my shock, the screen changed. Match found. Preparing lobby. My heart raced. I wasn't sure if it was excitement or unease. Who else could possibly still be playing this game? The game loaded, and I found myself standing on the familiar, foggy shoreline of the cove. My character was Sturgis, the grizzled fisherman with a salt and pepper beard and a trusty fishing rod. I had played as him countless times before, but this time something felt different. His model looked wrong. His eyes seemed too hollow, his movements a little too jerky. I heard a faint sound, a sort of static crackling, followed by distorted voices. The chat box in the corner of the screen filled with strange messages from my teammates. GW, stay still. Don't look at her. Too late now. Before I could make sense of their cryptic warnings, the game began. The map was just as I remembered it. The jagged cliffs, the abandoned shacks, the gnarled trees casting twisted shadows in the moonlight. The central well loomed in the distance, its gaping maw shrouded in mist. But everything felt darker, more oppressive. The once detailed textures of the game were now grainy, almost decayed, as if the world itself was rotting away. I didn't see my teammates, though I could hear their footsteps somewhere nearby. The static in my headphones grew louder, accompanied by faint whispers that sent a chill down my spine. And then I heard it. The sound of her. The Watcher. In the original game, the Watcher was an unsettling but somewhat balanced killer. Her gimmick was that she could disguise herself as one of the survivors until she got close enough to attack. But this time she didn't look the same. The soft, glowing eyes I remembered were gone, replaced by hollow voids. Her smile, which had always been a little unnerving, now stretched too wide, like it had been carved into her face. She floated silently across the map, her tattered cloak billowing as if caught in a phantom breeze. I froze, watching her from the shadows, my breath caught in my throat. One of my teammates, playing as the medic, ran toward her. "Please!" they screamed through their mic, their voice cracking. "Take me! End it!" I watched in horror as the Watcher reached out with her skeletal hands, pulling the player into the well. Their screams echoed, distorted and metallic, before cutting off abruptly. My screen flickered. The remaining teammate sent a single message in chat. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted through the cove, weaving between the wreckage of old boats and ducking behind crates. The Watcher's hollow eyes followed me, her smile never faltering. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with incomprehensible words. I made it to the edge of the map, where a small shack offered a moment of safety. I slammed the door shut behind me and crouched in the corner, my hands trembling on the keyboard. That's when I noticed the messages in the chat. "Jack, stop running. Look at her." My blood turned cold. How did they know my name? I alt-tabbed out of the game, my heart pounding. I needed to stop. This wasn't fun anymore. It was terrifying. But when I tried to close the game, my computer froze. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. "Jack, don't leave." I yanked off my headphones and hit the power button on my PC. The screen went black and the room fell silent. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at my reflection in the dark monitor. What had I just experienced? I told myself it was just a glitchy, abandoned game, a relic from the past with some broken code that made it creepy. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something I couldn't explain. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Watcher's hollow stare and her grotesque smile. I told myself I'd uninstall the game first thing in the morning and never think about it again. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that would be enough to escape her. The morning after my unsettling experience with Dreadfall Shore, I woke up drenched in sweat. My dreams, or rather nightmares, had been plagued by the Watcher. Her hollow eyes burned into my mind, her twisted grin etched deep into my memory. Every time I thought I'd escaped her in my dream, she'd reappear, closer than before, her whispers growing louder until I jolted awake. I sat at the edge of my bed, running a hand through my hair. The logical part of my brain told me it was all in my head, a result of an old buggy game combined with my overactive imagination. But the uneasy feeling in my gut refused to let go. I booted up my computer, determined to delete the game for good. As the desktop loaded, I glanced nervously at the corner of the screen where the icon for Dreadfall Shore sat. But the icon wasn't there. I blinked, confused. Did I uninstall it last night? I didn't remember doing that. To be sure, I opened the File Explorer and searched for the game's directory. Nothing. It was as if the game had never been there at all. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I moved my mouse to close the search window, my cursor froze. The screen flickered, and for a split second, I saw it. A single frame of the watcher's face, her hollow eyes staring directly at me. I yanked my hand away from the mouse, my heart hammering in my chest. The screen returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to step away from the computer and clear my head. Grabbing my jacket, I headed out for a walk around the neighborhood. The crisp morning air helped calm my nerves, and for a while, I managed to convince myself that everything was fine. But as I passed by the park near my apartment, I noticed something odd. The playground, usually filled with the laughter of children, was empty. The swings creaked gently in the breeze, their rhythmic motion eerily slow. And then I heard it, the whispers. At first they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves. But as I stood there frozen in place, they grew louder. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, taunting, beckoning. I turned sharply, scanning my surroundings. The park was empty, yet the whispers persisted, weaving through the air like tendrils of smoke. I forced myself to keep walking, quickening my pace until I was practically jogging. By the time I reached my apartment, my lungs burned and my heart felt like it was about to burst. I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The whispers were gone. "Get a grip, Jack," I muttered to myself. "You're letting a stupid game mess with your head." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. That evening, I avoided my computer entirely. I ordered takeout, put on a mindless sitcom, and did my best to distract myself. It worked for a while, until the power went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness. The hum of the fridge and the buzz of the TV abruptly silenced. I grabbed my phone, using its flashlight to navigate through the shadows. "Great," I muttered. "Just what I needed." I checked the breaker box in the hallway, but everything seemed fine. A quick glance out the window confirmed that the power outage was isolated to my apartment, and then I saw it. Reflected in the darkened screen of my TV was a figure standing in the corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, my phone's light cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there. I stood frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers started again, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I backed away slowly, my phone's flashlight sweeping across the room. As the beam passed over my computer desk, my heart dropped. The monitor was on. I hadn't touched it since the morning, but there it was, glowing softly in the darkness. The screen displayed the title menu of Dreadfall Shore. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't happening." I approached the desk cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. The game's title screen flickered, the stormy cove in the background shifting unnaturally. The join match button pulsed faintly, as if it were alive. Against my better judgment, I reached out and moved the mouse. The moment my hand touched it, the screen changed. "Match found. Preparing lobby." "No, no, no," I muttered, frantically trying to close the game. The keyboard was unresponsive, and neither the mouse nor the power button worked. It was as if the computer had taken on a life of its own. The game loaded, and I was back in the cove. The fog was thicker this time, the air heavy with an oppressive silence. My character, Sturgis, stood at the edge of the shoreline, his fishing rod clutched tightly in his hands. The chat box appeared, but the messages were different now. "Jack, you can't run. She's waiting." A cold sweat dripped down my back as I scanned the cove. The map seemed even more decayed than before. The trees were twisted beyond recognition, their branches clawing at the sky. The central well was no longer just ominous, it was pulsating, as if something inside it was alive. And then I saw her. The watcher stood at the edge of the well, her hollow eyes locked onto me. Her smile was wider than ever, stretching impossibly across her face. She didn't move, but I could feel her presence closing in, suffocating me. The whispers grew louder, drowning out every other sound. They weren't just in the game anymore. They were in the room with me. I ripped off my headphones and shoved the monitor away, the screen falling dark as it disconnected. For a brief moment, the whispers stopped. But then, behind me, I heard the faintest sound. A creak. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body tense. The apartment was empty, or so I thought. In the corner of the room, where I had seen the reflection earlier, a shadow moved. It wasn't just a trick of the light. The shadow shifted, growing taller, darker, more defined. Two hollow voids appeared where its eyes should have been, and the twisted grin followed, stretching impossibly wide. The Watcher. I stumbled backward, tripping over the chair and landing hard on the floor. My phone slipped from my hand, the flashlight spinning wildly and casting erratic beams of light across the room. The whispers surged, louder than ever, filling my head with incomprehensible words. The Watcher stepped closer, her movements impossibly fluid, as if she were gliding through the air. "Jack," she whispered, her voice layered and distorted. "You can't escape." I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, shaking so badly I could barely turn it. When I finally managed to get it open, I stumbled out into the hallway and slammed the door behind me. The whispers faded, but my heart continued to race. I stood there, gasping for breath, staring at the closed door as if it might burst open at any moment. The hallway was silent, save for the faint hum of the building's fluorescent lights. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. And then, from the other side of the door, I heard it. 3 soft knocks. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, not stopping until I was outside in the cold night air. The city lights were a welcome sight, their normalcy grounding me in reality. I didn't know what was happening or how to stop it. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. Not to my apartment, not to the game. But as I stood there catching my breath, I felt it again, that oppressive feeling of being watched. And in the reflection of a nearby storefront window, I saw her, the Watcher. She was still smiling, and she was closer than ever. I stood frozen, staring at the reflection in the glass. The Watcher's grin stretched impossibly wide, her hollow eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My instincts screamed at me to move, but my legs felt like they were encased in cement. Behind me, the streetlights flickered, their light dimming until the world seemed cloaked in shadow. The cold night air carried an eerie stillness, as though the city itself had held its breath. And then she moved. Not with a step, but with a sudden, unnatural lurch forward, like a film skipping frames. Her reflection in the glass grew larger, closer, her whispers clawing at the edges of my mind. It broke me free. I turned and ran, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The streets, usually bustling even at night, were disturbingly empty. I ran blindly, not caring where I was going as long as it was far away from her. I didn't stop until I reached the only place I could think of, the diner on the corner of Maple Street. It was a 24-hour joint, the kind of place where truckers and late-night wanderers gathered over greasy food and stale coffee. The bell above the door jingled as I stumbled inside, gasping for air. A waitress behind the counter looked up, her expression a mix of concern and surprise. "Are you okay?" she asked, setting down the coffee pot she'd been holding. I nodded, though I clearly wasn't. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. Just some fresh air," I mumbled, though my ragged breathing betrayed the truth. I slid into a booth near the back, where I could keep my eyes on the door. The diner felt safe, brightly lit, with the comforting hum of fluorescent lights and the chatter of an old radio playing classic rock. The waitress brought me a glass of water, which I downed in seconds. She hovered for a moment, as if deciding whether to press further, then returned to the counter. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe, but the reprieve didn't last long. My phone buzzed on the table. I jumped at the sound, my nerves still raw. When I picked it up, my stomach dropped. A new message. It wasn't from any number I recognized. In fact, it wasn't from a number at all. The sender field was blank. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Against my better judgment, I opened it. "You can't hide, Jack." The words were accompanied by an image, a grainy photo of me sitting in the booth, taken from outside the diner's window. I whipped my head around, scanning the street outside. The glass windows framed a perfectly ordinary view of the city. A couple walking their dog, a taxi idling at the curb. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw her. At the edge of the sidewalk, standing just beyond the pool of light cast by the diner's sign, was the Watcher. Her silhouette was unmistakable, her hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The sheer weight of her presence pressed down on me, suffocating and unrelenting. I couldn't stay here. She'd already found me. I grabbed my phone and bolted for the back exit, ignoring the waitress's startled shout as I shoved open the door. The alley behind the diner was narrow and dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of garbage. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. My frantic escape led me to an old motel on the outskirts of town, a dilapidated building with flickering neon lights that read vacancy. The man at the front desk barely looked up as I handed him cash for a room, his eyes glued to a static-filled television in the corner. The room was as shabby as I expected, peeling wallpaper, a sagging mattress, and a faint odor of mildew. But it didn't matter. It was somewhere to hide. I locked the door and pushed a rickety chair under the handle for good measure. Then I collapsed onto the bed, every muscle in my body aching from exhaustion. For a while, I just lay there, staring at the stained ceiling. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. None of it felt real. A game couldn't do this. It was just code, pixels on a screen. But the Watcher wasn't just part of the game anymore. She was here, in my world, and she wasn't going to stop until... I didn't want to think about it. I reached for my phone, intending to call someone, anyone, for help. But the screen refused to unlock. Instead, it displayed the same grainy image from earlier, the one of me in the diner. The whispers returned, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "Join us, Jack." I hurled the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud and fell to the floor. The screen shattered, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, filling the room until I couldn't hear anything else. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't external, it was inside my head. The lights flickered, and the room grew colder. My breath came out in visible puffs as the temperature plummeted, and then the shadows moved. They gathered in the corners of the room, coalescing into a dark, shapeless mass that pulsed and writhed like a living thing. From the center of the mass, two hollow voids appeared, followed by that grotesque grin. The Watcher emerged from the darkness, her form barely solid, like smoke given shape. I backed away until my legs hit the edge of the bed. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. Her grin widened. "Everything," she whispered. The room tilted, the walls closing in around me. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the shadows engulfed everything. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, my vision swimming. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room was empty. The shadows were gone. The lights were steady, and the air was warm again. But I wasn't alone. On the bed sat my laptop. I didn't bring it with me. It had been in my apartment, left behind in my frantic escape. But there it was, its screen glowing faintly. The game was open. Join match. The button pulsed. I didn't want to. I knew it was a trap. But I also knew I didn't have a choice. With trembling hands, I sat on the bed and clicked the button. The game loaded, and I was back in Dreadfall Shore. This time the map was unrecognizable. The cove was gone, replaced by a barren wasteland of cracked earth and dead trees. The sky was a sickly shade of red, and the air was filled with an eerie, low hum. My character, Sturgis, stood alone. The other players, if there ever had been any, were nowhere to be seen. The chat box appeared. "You can end this," the message read. "How?" I typed back, my fingers shaking. "Come to the well." I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn off the game, to destroy the laptop, to run. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The Watcher would find me no matter where I went. The well was at the center of the map, a gaping hole that seemed to swallow the light around it. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. When I reached the edge, the game forced my character to look down. The screen went black, and a single word appeared. "Jump." I hesitated, my finger hovering over the keyboard. "Jump, or it's over," the whispers urged. With a deep breath, I pressed the spacebar. Sturgis leapt into the darkness, and the screen went blank. But the whispers didn't stop. They were all around me now, in the room, in my head, louder and more chaotic than ever. The air grew cold again, and the shadows returned, swirling like a vortex. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the Watcher's face, her grin wider than ever. And then, there was nothing. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The sunlight streamed through the windows, the sounds of the city drifting in from outside. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The game was gone, the laptop missing. My phone, however, was on the nightstand, its screen repaired. A single notification blinked at me. "New match found. Are you ready to join?" The Watcher wasn't done with me. Not yet. The notification pulsed on my phone screen like a heartbeat. "New match found. Are you ready to join?" I stared at it, my mind racing. The Watcher had won the last round, but I was still here, alive, for now. That had to mean something. If she wanted me gone, she could have ended it in the motel room. So why keep playing this twisted game? The phone buzzed again, a vibration that sent shivers up my spine. This time the text beneath the notification shifted. "It's your turn to choose, Jack." Choose? The thought barely made sense. Every time I thought I had a shred of control, she yanked it away, leaving me scrambling in the dark. But something about the wording felt deliberate. This wasn't just a taunt, it was an opening. I took a deep breath and tapped the screen. The message app opened, revealing a single thread. The Watcher. Where will we play next? Below her question were two choices, written in stark white text. Return to Dreadfall Shore. Step outside. I froze. Return to the game, where the rules were hers? Or step outside where... What? She could manifest at will, break reality, and trap me in nightmares. What difference did it make? And then it hit me. This was the first time I'd been offered any semblance of agency. Even if it was an illusion, even if she controlled the options, I had to believe my choice mattered. My thumb hovered over the screen. Option 2, step outside. I pressed it. The moment I made my choice, the room seemed to shift. The sunlight dimmed, replaced by an unsettling gray haze. The walls of my apartment rippled as if they were made of liquid, their colors draining away until everything was a monochrome void. The phone in my hand dissolved into dust, scattering like ash in the breeze that wasn't there. I was no longer in my apartment. Instead, I stood in a familiar place, the street outside the diner. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting its sickly green glow over the empty sidewalk. The city around me was eerily silent, devoid of cars, people, or any signs of life. But something was different this time. The air felt heavier, charged with a static energy that prickled my skin. The watcher was close. A sound broke the stillness, a low, rhythmic creak, like the hinges of an old swing set. I turned toward the source and saw her. She was sitting on a bench across the street, her hollow eyes fixed on me, her grin as wide and unnatural as ever. In her hands, she held a small, weathered book, its cover blank. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to cross the street, one step at a time. As I approached, she tilted her head, watching me with a predatory curiosity. "Jack," she said, her voice a blend of whispers and echoes. "You made your choice. Now, let's play." I stopped a few feet away, my fists clenched. "What do you want from me?" Her grin widened, if that was even possible. "To see how far you'll go." She opened the book, revealing pages filled with strange symbols and sketches. They pulsed faintly, as if alive. "This," she said, tapping the page, "is where the story begins. But the ending? That's up to you." "What are you talking about?" I demanded. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned the book around and held it out to me. "Take it." I hesitated. The book radiated a dark energy, and every instinct screamed at me not to touch it. But the watcher's eyes bore into me, and I knew there was no other choice. With a shaky hand, I reached out and took the book. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, the world shifted again. I was no longer on the street. I stood in a cavernous chamber, its walls covered in the same symbols from the book. A faint, otherworldly light emanated from the ceiling, casting long shadows that danced like living things. In the center of the chamber was a pedestal, and on it sat a glowing orb. The watcher's voice echoed around me, though she was nowhere to be seen. "The rules are simple," she said. "The orb contains the truth you seek. Reach it, and the game ends. Fail." Her laughter filled the chamber, cold and mocking. I swallowed hard and stepped forward. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, shifting with every step. The air grew colder the closer I got to the pedestal, and the whispers returned, louder and more dissonant. Halfway there, the floor cracked open, revealing a black void beneath. From it emerged shadowy figures, their forms twisted and grotesque. Their hollow eyes locked onto me, and they began to advance. I ran. The pedestal was only a few feet away now, but the shadows were faster. They reached for me with elongated limbs, their whispers turning into guttural growls. I lunged for the orb, my fingers brushing its surface just as the shadows closed in. The light from the orb engulfed everything. When it faded, I was back in my apartment. The book lay open on the coffee table, its pages blank once more. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then my phone buzzed. I picked it up, my heart sinking as I read the message. "Well done, Jack. But there's always another match." And beneath it, "New match found. Are you ready to join?" This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened the message thread and typed back, "I'm ready." The screen flickered, and a new choice appeared. Return to Dreadfall Shore. Step outside. Find her. My breath caught. This was different. The third option glowed faintly, as if it held the weight of something final. I pressed it. The world dissolved around me, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness. In the center of it stood the Watcher, her form more solid now, her grin impossibly wide. "You think you can end this?" she asked, her voice dripping with amusement. "I don't care about the game," I said, stepping closer. "I want to know why. Why me? Why any of this?" Her grin faltered just for a moment. "You wanted to play," she said. "You clicked the link. You invited me in." The memory hit me like a freight train. The late-night email, the promise of a game like no other. I'd been bored, curious. I'd clicked without thinking. "And now?" I asked. "Now you're mine," she said, her grin returning. But this time, I didn't run. I stepped forward, holding the book out in front of me. The symbols on its cover began to glow, brighter and brighter, until the darkness around us began to crack. The watcher screamed, her form dissolving into shadows as the light consumed her. When it was over, I was alone. The book lay closed on the floor, its cover blank once more. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and opened it. Inside was a single line of text. "The match is over, but the game never ends." My phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't look. I grabbed the book and threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. The whispers faded. The air grew still. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was free. Or so I thought. Because later that night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed one last time. "New match found. Are you ready to join?" The glow of my phone screen illuminated the dark room like a lighthouse beacon cutting through the fog. I didn't dare move. My heart pounded against my ribs as the message burned itself into my mind. "New match found. Are you ready to join?" I thought I had ended it. The book was ashes in the fireplace, its haunting whispers silenced. But as I stared at the phone, an icy dread crept over me. It was her. It was always her. I reached for the phone, my fingers trembling, and swiped the notification away. My chest heaved as I let out a shaky breath. No, I wouldn't play her game anymore. The phone buzzed again, insistent this time. "You can't ignore me, Jack. Not now. Not ever." Her words wrapped around me like chains, pulling me back into her shadowed world. But beneath the fear, anger simmered. She thought I was hers to torment, a pawn in her endless game. Not anymore. I stood, gripping the phone tightly, and began pacing the room. "What do you want from me?" I whispered harshly, as if she could hear. The room seemed to respond, the air growing heavy and charged. The faint sound of laughter echoed around me, soft at first, but growing louder. "You'll find out," her voice said, disembodied and everywhere at once. "If you're brave enough to accept the invitation." Another buzz. This time a new message appeared on the screen. "Last chance, Jack. Choose wisely." Beneath her words were 3 options, each glowing faintly. Join the game. Fight the watcher. Discover the truth. My breath hitched. The 3rd option pulsed softly, a beacon of curiosity and danger. The truth. That's what I wanted. No more running, no more games. I tapped the 3rd option. The phone dissolved in my hand, turning to fine dust that floated into the air before vanishing. The room around me flickered and distorted, colors bleeding into one another until everything was a swirling, kaleidoscopic void. I fell, weightless, endless, until my feet hit solid ground. When the world righted itself, I was standing in a grand hall. The walls were made of black stone, their surfaces etched with the same symbols from the book. Torches lined the space, their flames casting dancing shadows across the floor. At the end of the hall stood the Watcher. But she wasn't the grinning specter I'd seen before. She was different. Her form was sharper, more defined, her hollow eyes now glowing with a piercing white light. Her grin was gone, replaced by an expression of cold indifference. "You chose the truth," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "Are you ready to face it?" I swallowed hard but nodded. "I want to know why. Why me? Why this game?" She tilted her head, studying me. "The truth is not what you think it is, Jack, but if you insist." She raised a hand, and the symbols on the walls began to glow. The air shimmered, and the space around us warped and twisted. In an instant, I was no longer in the hall. I stood in a small, cluttered room, a teenager's bedroom. Posters lined the walls, a gaming console sat on the floor, and a computer desk was tucked into the corner. The screen glowed faintly, displaying a familiar logo, Dreadfall Shore. I frowned, stepping closer. On the desk sat a worn notebook, its pages filled with messy handwriting and sketches. The title on the first page made my stomach drop. The Watcher, a game of fear and choices. "What is this?" I muttered, flipping through the pages. "This," the Watcher's voice said from behind me, "is where it began." I spun around to find her standing in the doorway, her form now flickering between her shadowy visage and that of an ordinary woman, young, with dark hair and sharp eyes. "You wrote this?" I asked, holding up the notebook. She smiled faintly, a shadow of her former grin. "Not quite, but someone like you did." "Like me?" She nodded. "Curious, restless, seeking something more." The room shifted again, and I was standing in front of a mirror. But the reflection staring back wasn't mine. It was her. "You created me, Jack," she said, her voice soft. "Not with pen and paper, but with your actions, your choices. You invited me into your world, and I've been here ever since." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I didn't create you. You've been haunting me, twisting my life into this nightmare." She stepped closer, her reflection overlapping mine. "What is a nightmare, if not a creation of the mind? You gave me form, Jack. You gave me power." The mirror shattered, and I was back in the hall. The Watcher stood before me, her form fully solid now, her eyes piercing into mine. "Every choice you've made," she said, "every fear you've faced, has brought you closer to this moment. You wanted the truth, and now you have it." I clenched my fists. "If I created you, then I can destroy you." Her laughter was low and chilling. "You can try." The hall transformed into a battlefield, the walls crumbling away to reveal an endless expanse of darkness. Symbols etched themselves into the ground, glowing with a fierce, otherworldly light. The Watcher raised her hands, and shadowy figures emerged from the void, their forms twisted and monstrous. "You've played the game," she said, her voice resonating through the space. "Now, let's see if you can end it." I took a deep breath and charged forward. The shadows swarmed around me, their whispers turning into deafening roars. I fought with everything I had, dodging their attacks and striking back with whatever I could find. A shard of light here, a burst of energy there. The Watcher watched from afar, her expression unreadable. "You can't win, Jack," she said. "Not against me." But I didn't stop. The symbols beneath my feet pulsed with each step, their light growing brighter. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving as the light consumed them. The Watcher's calm facade cracked. She raised her hands, summoning more shadows, but it was too late. The symbols surged with power, creating a blinding wave of light that swept across the battlefield. When the light faded, she was gone. I stood alone in the void, the silence deafening. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, a familiar voice echoed around me. "Well done, Jack." I turned to see the Watcher standing a few feet away, her form now translucent, her grin faint. "You've proven yourself," she said, "but the game never truly ends." "What does that mean?" I demanded. She tilted her head, her figure fading. "You'll find out. Eventually." And with that, she vanished. I woke up in my apartment, the sunlight streaming through the windows. The book was gone, the symbols were gone, and my phone lay silent on the table. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. But deep down, I knew she was still out there, watching, waiting, because the game never truly ends. For a brief moment, life resumed its fragile normalcy. The eerie silence in my apartment became a welcome companion, one that allowed me to convince myself the nightmare had ended. I returned to work, spent weekends reorganizing my life, and even started taking long walks to clear my head. But the truth lingered like a splinter buried just beneath the surface of my skin. The Watcher's final words echoed in my mind. The game never truly ends. It started subtly, as it always did. I was walking home one evening, the sky bruised with streaks of orange and purple. The hum of city life buzzed around me, honking cars, snippets of conversations, the occasional bark of a dog. Yet something felt off. The crowd seemed thinner than usual. The air felt heavier. And then I noticed it. A figure in the distance, leaning casually against a lamppost. She was dressed in a simple black coat, her head tilted as though studying something fascinating. Even from a distance, I felt her gaze pierce through me. My feet froze. No, it couldn't be her. Not here. Not now. But the figure didn't move, didn't make any attempt to approach. She simply stood there, watching. I forced myself to walk past her, heart pounding, eyes fixed firmly on the ground. When I finally glanced back, the lamppost was empty. That night, sleep eluded me. The clock on my nightstand ticked louder than usual, its steady rhythm amplifying the tension in my chest. Shadows danced on the walls, their shapes too deliberate to be products of random light. At 3:15 a.m., I gave up on pretending to sleep and grabbed my phone. Scrolling aimlessly, I stumbled upon a notification. Reminder, a new game awaits. I stared at the screen, dread seeping into my bones. The app wasn't installed on my phone anymore. I had deleted it weeks ago. I pressed the notification, and the screen went black. A single line of text appeared. "You're not done yet." The phone screen shattered into static, and a voice, her voice, whispered, "Find me." The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Paranoia clung to me like a second skin as I navigated my day. At the grocery store, I felt her eyes in the reflective freezer doors. On the subway, her laughter echoed faintly over the rattle of the train. By the time I returned home, my nerves were frayed. I locked the door behind me and checked every room, every corner. Nothing. But then I noticed it. A piece of paper on my kitchen table. I hadn't put it there. It was a page torn from a notebook, the edges frayed and worn. Scrawled across it in jagged handwriting were 3 words: "Look beneath you." My blood ran cold. I glanced down and saw nothing but the wooden floor. Hesitantly, I knelt and tapped on the floorboards. One of them was loose. Prying it up revealed a small, hidden compartment. Inside was something I hadn't seen in weeks: the book. I stumbled back, my chest tightening. I had burned it, watched the flames consume it. Yet, here it was, its cover pristine and unmarked, as though it had never been touched by fire. The symbols on the cover glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed for me to destroy it again, to get as far away from it as possible. But the words on the page, the whispers from the void, they demanded my attention. With trembling hands, I flipped it open. The pages weren't blank this time. Instead, they were filled with a new set of instructions, as though the book was alive, adapting to my choices. The final stage begins. It read, "Follow the path, uncover the truth, or succumb to the darkness." Beneath the text was an address. The address led me to a decrepit building on the outskirts of the city. Its windows were shattered, and graffiti covered the walls. The air around it seemed unnaturally still, as though the world had abandoned this place long ago. I hesitated at the entrance, the oppressive silence pressing against my ears. But the book had drawn me here, and I couldn't turn back now. Inside, the air was damp and cold. The faint smell of mildew and decay hung heavy in the air. I followed the corridor, my footsteps echoing off the cracked tiles. At the end of the hallway was a door. Unlike the rest of the building, the door was pristine, its surface smooth and polished. Etched into it were the same symbols from the book, glowing faintly in the dim light. I placed my hand on the handle. The metal was warm, pulsing beneath my fingers. When I opened the door, I was greeted by darkness. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. The room was vast, its boundaries impossible to discern. The only light came from a series of floating orbs, their glow faint and eerie. And then she appeared. The Watcher stood at the center of the room, her form more solid than ever. Her eyes no longer glowed. Instead, they burned with a fiery intensity. "You came," she said, her voice both familiar and alien. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" She smiled faintly. "You already know the answer." "No, I don't," I shouted. "You keep saying I created you, but I didn't. You're just a nightmare that refuses to end." Her expression softened, almost pitying. "Jack, do you really believe that?" The room shifted around us, and suddenly, we were standing in my childhood bedroom. I stared at the space, my heart sinking. The posters on the walls, the worn-out gaming console, the cluttered desk. It was all exactly as I remembered. The Watcher gestured to the desk. "Go on," she said. Hesitantly, I approached and picked up the notebook sitting on the desk. It was the same one I'd seen before, filled with sketches and notes. But as I flipped through the pages, a chilling realization dawned on me. The handwriting was mine. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This can't be real." The Watcher stepped closer, her presence suffocating. "You created me, Jack. In your loneliness, in your need to escape, you gave me life. You gave me purpose." I dropped the notebook, my hands trembling. "No, I didn't mean to." "But you did," she said, her voice soft. "And now, you have a choice." The room shifted again, and I was back in the vast, dark space. The floating orbs hovered around us, their light intensifying. "Choose, Jack," she said, her form flickering. "You can end this, or you can embrace it." A glowing symbol appeared on the ground in front of me. "If you destroy me," she said, "you'll forget everything. Your life will return to normal, but the void inside you will remain." "And if I don't?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She smiled faintly. "Then you'll understand. You'll see the truth of what we are." I hesitated, the weight of the decision crushing me. The light from the symbol grew brighter, and her form began to fade. "Make your choice, Jack," she said, her voice echoing. "The game never truly ends, but it's your game now." I stepped forward, my decision made. As the light consumed us both, her voice whispered one final time, "Welcome to the truth, to the..." Last fall, I moved to a small town in Oregon. It was a bit different from where I was from, and I really liked the idea of the quiet forests and long, winding trails. So one day, my friend Carter, who was a big outdoor enthusiast, invited me and a few others for a weekend camping trip. He was always the one suggesting adventures, and I thought it would be a nice break from the usual routine. I'd never been camping in a forest like this before, so it seemed like the perfect opportunity to explore. Carter had a group of 5 friends, including me. There was also his older brother, Ethan, who was a bit of a quiet guy but super strong, always carrying way more than anyone else. Then there was Oliver, the funny guy who always made everyone laugh, and Rachel, who was pretty smart and kept track of everything, like a camp manager. Lastly, there was our dog, Max, a big friendly Labrador who loved running around the woods. We set out early on a Saturday morning, driving about 20 miles from the nearest town to a spot Carter knew well. It was deep in the woods, far away from any other people. The trees were tall, and the whole place felt like something out of a movie. The forest was thick with pine and oak trees, and the ground was covered with leaves that crunched underfoot. I was excited but also a bit nervous. I'd never been this far out into the wilderness before. We parked the cars along an old dirt road, the kind that only hunters or park rangers used. We hiked for about 4 miles, and by the time we reached our campsite, it was starting to get dark. I didn't mind though. The air was crisp, and everything felt peaceful. Carter pulled out the tents, and we all got to work setting them up. Rachel, Oliver, and Ethan decided to gather some firewood while Carter and I worked on the tents. Max was wagging his tail, sniffing around the campsite. The tents went up quickly, and we got the fire started with some dry branches we found nearby. But the others were taking longer than expected. We started to get worried when the sun had almost fully set, and they still hadn't returned. That's when we heard something. It wasn't the sound of animals, but of someone running through the woods. We all froze. Then, out of the shadows, Rachel and Ethan appeared, wide-eyed and out of breath. They had Max with them, but the dog was acting strange, looking behind them and growling at something we couldn't see. They started talking all at once, saying they had seen something weird in the woods. They had gone looking for firewood when they came across one of the others, Brandon. But he wasn't acting like himself. He was walking strangely, and every time they tried to approach him, he would move away. When they got closer again, he disappeared completely and then reappeared just a few feet behind them. They said it smelled awful, like rotten meat. And at one point, Brandon just sprinted off into the woods, and Max chased after him. The smell came and went, and they kept hearing strange noises in the distance. At first, it sounded like someone crying, but then it turned into a loud screeching. They tried calling out to Brandon and Max, but they didn't answer. Finally, the smell returned, stronger than before, and it was mixed with strange giggling sounds. We were all freaked out by this point, and even though we tried to brush it off as a joke, we couldn't ignore the tension. As we huddled around the fire, Max suddenly started growling loudly again. I had never heard him so upset before. His fur was bristling, and he was staring into the woods, not moving an inch. Then, just as Carter was about to fire a shot into the woods to scare whatever it was off, the smell got stronger, and the ground beneath us seemed to tremble. The woods seemed alive with movement, like something was circling us. We all stayed close, clutching our flashlights and keeping our weapons close, even though I didn't know what to expect. Carter fired 3 rounds into the trees. The forest erupted with a terrifying screech, and whatever it was retreated quickly. We waited for a long time in silence, hoping it was over. But the smell lingered, and every so often we heard strange, half-laughing noises from the darkness. We decided to stay awake in shifts. I volunteered to take first watch with Rachel. Max stayed by our side, his growls low and constant. About 2 hours into our watch, everything went quiet. It felt wrong, like the forest had completely gone still. Then, suddenly, Greg, who had been sleeping in the tent, rushed outside, yelling something about hearing Max bark. We all scrambled out of our tents. Greg was shining his flashlight into the trees, calling for Tom, one of the guys who had been with Rachel and Ethan earlier. Tom had gone out to look for Max when the dog ran off, but they hadn't heard from him for a while. We gathered our gear and ventured into the woods, hoping to find him. We followed Tom's tracks for a while, but then, just as quickly as they had appeared, his footprints stopped. There were no more signs of him. Then one of us, Oliver, I think, shined his flashlight into the darkness, and we saw him. Tom was standing about 20 feet away from us, his body stiff and unmoving. "Tom?" we called out. "Are you okay?" He just stood there, not saying anything. His head moved slowly as if something was controlling him. His eyes were wide and lifeless. Rachel tried to approach him, but I felt this chill run through me. Something wasn't right. Then just like that, he turned and walked into the woods without saying a word. We tried to follow him, but he moved too quickly. The forest was closing in on us, and we couldn't keep up. Back at the camp, we set up a tight watch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching us. The giggling returned, and it sounded closer this time. We could hear it, like it was coming from all directions at once, mocking us, drawing us in. I didn't want to believe it, but the air felt heavier, colder, like we weren't alone. As the night dragged on, we heard a voice calling out from the woods. It sounded like Tom, but it was wrong. His voice was twisted, like someone was trying to mimic him, but it didn't quite fit. The giggling was louder, more frantic. We had to leave. By dawn, we packed everything quickly and made our way back to the cars. But when we got there, something was waiting for us. The cars were scratched, windows smashed, and the seats torn apart like something had been inside. We couldn't get out of there fast enough. As we drove away, I thought I saw Tom's face in the trees, watching us go. His grin was the last thing I saw before we left that place behind. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that I will never camp so far out again, not without a lot more people and a lot more light. I think we encountered something that was never meant to be seen, something that followed us home, in the shadows. My name is Maxwell, and I have a strange story to share. I've been thinking about it for a long time now, almost 2 years, and I'm still not sure if it was a real creepy moment or if I just made it all seem scary because I kept thinking about it too much. My wife Jenna keeps telling me it's something I should share with you, though. She remembers me telling her about it, and after hearing it again, she thinks it's creepy too. She doesn't remember exactly how it felt at the time, but after I explained it to her again, she got that same uneasy feeling. I guess you could say this story still kind of haunts me, and I really don't know what to make of it. So here's the story. I grew up in a small town, but I never really liked it there. There was always something about the place that felt off. But my family, they were the sort of people who could never imagine living anywhere else. We ran a small family-owned restaurant. It wasn't the biggest business, but it was enough for us to get by. My father started it when he was young, and when he passed away, the restaurant was handed down to me. I was proud of it, but after a while, it started to feel like a struggle. Running a business in a small town wasn't as profitable as it used to be. People didn't go out to eat as much, and the younger crowd had moved away to bigger cities. I thought I might have a better shot at things if I moved somewhere new. That's when I started looking for a place to open a restaurant somewhere else. I wanted to find a quiet little town with potential, somewhere with good people who still cared about the kind of food my family made. I wanted to find the kind of place where I could make a living and raise a family. After searching for a while, I came across a little town in the Midwest. It wasn't too big, about 20,000 people, and it seemed like the kind of place where I could start fresh. I figured it was a good bet since it was close to a college town, which could mean a steady flow of customers. At first, the town looked perfect. The main street was lined with small shops and old brick buildings. There was a school, a hospital, and a lot of beautiful homes. It all looked so inviting, like a postcard you'd send home from vacation. But the more I drove around, the more something started to feel strange. It was so quiet, too quiet for a Saturday afternoon. For a town of 20,000, the main street should have been filled with people enjoying the weekend. But it wasn't. The streets were empty, like everyone had just disappeared. I thought maybe I'd come on the wrong day, or that people were busy with something. But as I walked up and down the street, I barely saw anyone. I counted the people I saw on one hand. Most of the stores seemed like they were barely holding on. It was like I'd walked into some strange ghost town, and I started to wonder what was going on. I stopped an older woman on the sidewalk, thinking maybe I could ask her if it was always this quiet. But when I approached her and said hello, she didn't even look at me. She walked right by like I wasn't even there. I was so shocked that I laughed to myself, thinking maybe I was imagining it. But then I tried again, stopping another person. This time, the man I spoke to talked to me, but his words were strange. He shrugged when I asked where everyone was and just said, "It's a quiet town. We like it that way." He didn't seem interested in talking more, and he quickly turned and walked away. At that point, I was pretty sure this town wasn't right for me. But as I was getting ready to leave, I noticed my car's gas was getting low, so I pulled into a small gas station at the edge of town to fill up. When I got out of my car and started pumping gas, I was shocked by the price. The meter was crawling so slowly, and I realized the price was way cheaper than I expected. It made me feel a little better about being in this weird town, so I went inside to pay. The man behind the counter looked like he was in his late 50s. He had messy gray hair and wore a dirty shirt, sitting behind a counter and watching an old TV. But for the first time since I'd arrived, someone actually smiled at me. He was friendly, and when I complimented him on his low gas prices, he seemed pleased. "Thanks for the compliment," he said. "Not many people appreciate the good prices around here." I paid for my gas, and as I was about to leave, I mentioned that I was thinking about moving to town to open a restaurant. That's when his face changed. It wasn't like he got mad or anything, but his expression went from warm to something almost fearful. He stared at me for a long moment before whispering, "Don't move here." I didn't believe what I'd just heard at first. I thought maybe I misheard him, so I asked him to repeat it. "What did you say?" I asked. His voice dropped even lower. "Don't move here," he said again, barely above a whisper. Before I could say anything else, a woman, his wife, I assume, came out of the back room. She looked at me, then at her husband, and without saying anything, she quickly addressed him by name. The way she spoke to him was calm, but there was something in her voice that made me think she knew something was wrong. The man's face went pale, and he started acting like he was hiding something. It was like he had just gotten caught doing something bad, and he didn't want anyone to know. The woman turned to me and asked, "Is there anything else I can help you with?" I said no, and she told me, "I think you better leave now." And just like that, she disappeared back into the back room, leaving her husband standing there looking uncomfortable. I didn't want to make a scene, so I quickly left the gas station, got back in my car, and drove off. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. I kept telling myself it was just a weird coincidence, but deep down, I felt like I had walked into something I wasn't meant to see. The whole thing bothered me for a long time, and I kept thinking about it. What did the gas station guy mean when he told me not to move there? Why was he so afraid? It didn't make any sense, and I couldn't stop wondering about it. Even though I told my wife about it when I got home, she didn't think too much of it at first. But now, after hearing it all again, she admits she would have been just as freaked out as I was. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I've been wondering if anyone else has had a similar experience in that town. I don't want to name the place because I don't want to cause trouble or make people think there's something wrong with it. But whatever it is, it was definitely the strangest, most uncomfortable feeling I've ever had. I know I'll never go back there, and I have no desire to find out more. Sometimes it's better not to know what's lurking behind the closed doors of a quiet town. So that's my story, and I'm sharing it because I hope someone out there might have some answers. Maybe someone else has been to that town or experienced something like I did. But if you're thinking of visiting or moving there, maybe it's best to listen to the warning I got. And if you don't hear from me again, well, I guess you'll know I made the right choice. The board game store wasn't exactly a bustling hive of activity. On most weekdays, the hours crawled by with only the occasional customer wandering in to browse or ask for recommendations. It wasn't a big chain or a fancy polished shop, just a cozy little store tucked into the corner of a strip mall in Seattle. The kind of place where the smell of cardboard and plastic wafted through the air, where shelves overflowed with colorful boxes boasting names like Catan, Pandemic, and Ticket to Ride. I'd been working there for about 6 months. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills, and gave me enough downtime to scroll through my phone when things got slow. That day started out like any other, quiet and uneventful. I'd rearranged a shelf of strategy games, restocked dice sets, and was halfway through realphabetizing the role-playing books when the bell above the door jingled. I glanced up, ready with my usual welcome in spiel. The man who walked in didn't reply. He was tall and thin, with a scruffy beard and a worn hoodie that looked like it had seen better days. His jeans hung loose on his frame, and his sneakers squeaked faintly against the polished floor. Nothing about him screamed weird at first glance, but there was something off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. He wandered toward the back of the store where the cooperative games were shelved. I watched him for a moment before going back to my task. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange. The man wasn't just browsing. He was standing completely still, his back to me. His posture was rigid, and his head tilted slightly forward, as if he were staring intently at something. I wouldn't have thought much of it, except for the way the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I froze, unsure why I felt so uneasy. When he turned slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his profile in my peripheral vision, I nearly dropped the stack of game boxes I was holding. His mouth was wide open, stretched unnaturally, like he was screaming silently. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and almost lifeless. It wasn't a face anyone could make naturally. It was grotesque, wrong, like something out of a nightmare. My stomach clenched, and I forced myself to look up fully. "Hey, are you?" But the moment I faced him directly, the man looked completely normal again. No wide-open mouth, no dead eyes, just a guy reading the back of a game box. He turned to me, his lips quirking into a small smile. "Yo," he said casually, holding up the box of Wingspan. "I keep hearing about this one. Is it any good?" I blinked, trying to push the earlier image out of my mind. Yeah, it's pretty popular. Personally, I think it's a bit overrated, but a lot of people love it." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'm trying to find something my girlfriend might actually play. She's not really into board games, though, and she hates competitive stuff. Got any suggestions?" I latched onto the conversation, eager to distract myself from what I'd just seen, or thought I'd seen. "You might want to try a roll and write game. They're technically competitive, but you don't really interact with the other players much. It's more like doing your own thing on your own board. Pretty beginner-friendly, too." He seemed interested, so I turned to grab a copy of Cartographers from behind the counter. But as I turned back, my heart nearly stopped. He was standing right in front of the counter, much closer than before. Too close. His mouth was gaping open again, wider than seemed humanly possible, and his eyes, they were dead, vacant, as if he weren't really there. It was the exact same face I'd seen in my periphery earlier. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My hand instinctively tightened around the box of Cartographers. But as soon as I met his gaze head-on, the terrifying expression was gone, just like that. He looked at me, normal as ever, with a slight furrow of his brow. "You okay there, my dude?" he asked, his voice laced with mild concern. I forced a shaky laugh, trying to mask the panic that was bubbling up inside me. "Yeah, sorry. Long day." I slid the game across the counter toward him. "This one's our top-selling roll and write. I think she'd like it." He studied the box, nodding slowly. "Yeah, this might work. Thanks." He pulled out his phone. "Can I place an order for it? Don't have my wallet on me right now." "Sure," I said, grabbing the order log. As I took down his name and number, I couldn't help but notice that the unease hadn't left me. If anything, it was growing stronger. Every time I glanced away from him, even for a second, I saw that horrifying image of him, mouth open, eyes dead, in my peripheral vision. But when I looked at him directly, he was just a regular guy. It didn't make any sense. "Cool, thanks," he said once the order was placed. "You'll call me when it's in, right?" "Yeah," I replied, my voice tight. "Shouldn't take more than a week." He nodded and turned to leave. The bell jingled as the door swung shut behind him. I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hands were trembling slightly as I leaned against the counter, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I imagining things? Was I just tired? Or stressed? Maybe I'd been staring at screens too much lately, and my eyes were playing tricks on me. That had to be it. There was no other explanation. People didn't just look like that. Not in real life. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My mind kept replaying the image of his face, the unnatural way his mouth stretched open, the lifelessness of his eyes, and the way it only happened when I wasn't looking directly at him. It sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to focus on work, but the rest of the shift passed in a haze. Every time the bell above the door jingled, I jumped, half expecting to see the strange man again, but he didn't come back. That night, as I locked up the store and walked to my car, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few steps. The parking lot was empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But even as I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got home, I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted. I stared at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my brain misfiring. I'd heard of optical illusions and peripheral vision playing tricks on people. That had to be it. There was no other logical explanation. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. Something about the whole encounter felt wrong. And as much as I wanted to forget about it, I had a feeling this wasn't the last time I'd see that strange customer. The days that followed were strangely quiet, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. Every time I thought of that customer, my stomach twisted into knots. I couldn't shake the image of his gaping mouth and lifeless eyes. It lingered like a shadow, just out of reach but always present. Work didn't help either. The store was slow, even for a place like ours. I spent hours reorganizing shelves, dusting off boxes, and scrolling through my phone. Every time the bell over the door jingled, my pulse spiked, and I would glance up, half expecting him to walk in again. But he didn't. A week passed, and the order he'd placed for cartographers came in. I pulled the box from the shipment and set it on the reserved shelf with his name on it. Kyle Turner, the tag read in blocky letters. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if I should give him a call to let him know it was ready. But something held me back. Instead, I went home early that evening feeling drained and restless. That night, I sat at my small kitchen table, fiddling absent-mindedly with an old pocket watch that I'd pulled from a drawer earlier in the day. It had been my dad's. A family heirloom, he'd said. The metal was cold and tarnished, its glass face cracked like a spider web. The hands of the watch were frozen at 4:13, and it hadn't ticked in years. I wasn't sure why I'd taken it out. I hadn't thought about the watch in months, maybe years, but something about the last week had made me want to see it again. Dad had always been so cryptic about it, saying it told time in a different way. As a kid, I'd thought it was a cool bit of family folklore. Now, as an adult, it felt more like a strange riddle I'd never quite solved. I turned the watch over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. It wasn't heavy, but it had a presence to it, a kind of gravity that made it hard to ignore. I must have fallen asleep at the table because when I woke up, the watch was still clutched in my hand. My neck ached from leaning awkwardly against the edge of the table. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I stood up, groggy, and stumbled toward the bathroom to splash some water on my face. When I flipped on the light and looked into the mirror, my heart stopped. For a split second, just a flicker in the corner of my vision, I saw it. My own reflection, but wrong. My mouth hung open, unnaturally wide, and my eyes stared blankly, devoid of life. It was the same expression I'd seen on that customer's face. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing behind me. I turned back to the mirror and my reflection was normal again. Just me, looking tired and a little pale. I gripped the edge of the sink, breathing hard. What the hell is wrong with me? I muttered. The memory of that strange man in the store flooded back, and with it a creeping dread. Was I losing my mind? Or was something else going on? The next day I decided to do something about it. After work, I sat down at the computer and typed Kyle Turner into a search engine. It felt a little creepy to be Googling a customer, but I needed answers. The first result that popped up made my blood run cold. It was an obituary. Kyle Turner, 34, passed away suddenly on date. The date was the day after he'd come into the store. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. That couldn't be right. He'd been fine when I saw him. A little strange, sure, but alive. And yet, here it was in black and white. He was dead. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. What did it mean? Was it just a coincidence? Or was it something more? My eyes drifted to the pocket watch on the table next to me. The cracked glass glinted faintly in the light. That night, the dream started. I was standing in the store, alone. The shelves were empty, the lights dim. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. In the dream, I was holding the pocket watch. The hands had moved. They were no longer frozen at 4:13, but ticking backward, slowly and deliberately. As I watched, shadows began to creep along the edges of the store. They weren't just dark, they were alive, writhing and shifting like smoke. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. People. They stood just at the edge of my vision, their mouths wide open in silent screams, their eyes staring blankly. There were dozens of them, maybe more. They didn't move, but I could feel them watching me. I tried to look directly at them, but every time I turned my head, they disappeared, only to reappear the moment I looked away. The ticking of the watch grew louder, echoing in my ears. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe. And then I woke up, gasping for air. The days blurred together after that. The dreams kept coming, each one more vivid than the last. The pocket watch seemed to be at the center of it all. I started carrying it with me everywhere, unable to let it go. At work, the sense of unease grew stronger. It wasn't just in my dreams anymore. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Shapes, figures that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. And it wasn't just at the store, at the coffee shop, in the park, even in my own apartment. I felt like I was being watched. The world around me seemed to shift subtly, like reality itself was bending under the weight of something unseen. One afternoon, as I was closing up the store, I caught sight of a man standing across the parking lot. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel his gaze. I froze, my hand on the door handle. The pocket watch in my pocket felt heavier than ever. When I looked again, the man was gone. Desperate for answers, I started digging into the watch's history. I called my mom, asked her if she knew anything about it. "Your dad always said it was a family heirloom," she said. "It belonged to his father, and his father before that. But honestly, I don't know much about it. Why are you asking about it now?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain. "Just curious, I guess." "Well," she said, her tone softening, "your dad always said it was special, but I don't think he meant that in a good way." "What do you mean?" She sighed. "He used to say it showed him things no one else could see. He never told me what he meant, and I didn't want to ask. He seemed haunted by it." Haunted. The word sent a chill down my spine. As the days went on, the visions grew more frequent. I started seeing the dead more often, not just in my dreams, but in real life. People in the periphery of my vision, their faces twisted in silent agony. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The pocket watch seemed to hum with energy, pulling me deeper into its orbit. And then, one night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something. The watch wasn't just showing me the dead. It was showing me what was to come. The revelation hit me like a thunderclap. The pocket watch wasn't just a cursed heirloom. It was a window into something far worse. It showed me not only the dead, but those who were about to die. Each fleeting vision, each twisted face in my periphery, wasn't random. It was a warning. I sat in the dark of my apartment, the weight of the realization pressing down on me. The watch rested on the table in front of me, its cracked face glinting faintly under the dull glow of a desk lamp. The hands were still frozen at 4:13, but it didn't feel lifeless. On the contrary, it felt alive, as if it were watching me as much as I was watching it. "What the hell do I do with you?" I muttered, running a hand through my hair. The question echoed in the silence of the room, but no answer came. The next day, I resolved to test my theory. It was a desperate, stupid idea, but I needed to know if I was right. At the store, I kept an eye on everyone who walked in, paying close attention to their behavior and their expressions. I felt like a lunatic, scrutinizing every twitch and gesture, but I couldn't help it. I needed to know if the watch's curse, or gift, was real. Around midday, a man walked in. He was middle-aged, wearing a rumpled suit and a distracted expression. He browsed the shelves for a while, occasionally picking up a box to examine it before putting it back. At first, he seemed perfectly normal. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. His face twisted into that same grotesque mask I'd seen before. His mouth gaped open, his eyes stared blankly ahead, and his skin looked pale and waxy, almost translucent. I felt my stomach lurch. For a moment, I couldn't move. The sight of him like that froze me in place, and it took every ounce of willpower to look away. When I finally did, I turned to face him directly. He was normal again. "Hey," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Can I help you find something?" He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't noticed me standing there. "Oh no, I'm just browsing," he said with a polite smile. "Thanks, though." I nodded, but my mind was racing. Was he next? Would he die soon? As he left the store, I debated whether to say something. What could I say? "Hey, I think you might die soon because I saw your ghostly face out of the corner of my eye. Maybe take it easy for a while?" No, there was nothing I could do. That night, the dreams returned, more vivid than ever. I was back in the store, but it wasn't the same. The shelves were lined with strange, unmarked boxes, and the air felt heavy and oppressive. The pocket watch was in my hand, ticking softly. Shadows crept along the edges of the room, and the figures returned, those same twisted faces, their mouths open in silent screams. But this time, they were closer. I could feel their presence, like cold breath on the back of my neck. One of them stepped forward. It was the man from the store, the one in the rumpled suit. He reached out a hand, his fingers skeletal and trembling. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I woke up gasping for air. The sheets tangled around me. My heart was racing, and sweat drenched my skin. The dream felt too real, too vivid to ignore. The next morning, I checked the news. I didn't even know what I was looking for, but I needed to know if something had happened to that man. It didn't take long to find it. "Local man killed in hit-and-run accident," the headline read. The article described the man as a middle-aged professional who had been crossing the street near his office when a speeding car struck him. He died instantly. The photo attached to the article showed his face. It was the man from the store. My stomach churned, and I had to set my phone down to keep from throwing it across the room. It was real. The watch wasn't just showing me random visions. It was showing me death itself. The days that followed were a blur. I started seeing the twisted faces more often, in more places. On the bus, in the park, at the grocery store. Everywhere I went, there they were, lurking just at the edge of my vision. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The watch had attached itself to me, and there was no escaping it. One evening, I decided to visit my mom. She was the only person who might have answers, and I was desperate. Her house was a small, cozy place on the outskirts of town. She greeted me warmly, as she always did, but I could tell she noticed something was off. "You look tired," she said, her brow furrowing. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain. Finally, I pulled the pocket watch from my pocket and held it out to her. "Do you know anything about this?" I asked. Her face paled. "That's your father's watch," she said softly. "I know, but there's something wrong with it. I think it's cursed or something." She didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, she nodded slowly, her expression troubled. "Your dad always said it was special," she said. "He called it a blessing and a curse. He told me it showed him things he didn't always want to see." "Like what?" She hesitated, then sighed. "He never told me exactly, but he would get these feelings about people. Sometimes he'd tell them to be careful, to take a different path or avoid certain places. He thought the watch was trying to warn him, to help him save people." I swallowed hard. Did it work? Did he save anyone? She shook her head. "I don't know. He didn't talk about it much, but I think it weighed on him." Her words only confirmed what I already knew. The watch wasn't just showing me death. It was showing me the possibility of changing it. But was that even possible? That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the watch. It felt heavier than ever, as if the weight of all those lives was pressing down on me. I thought about the man in the store, about the dream where he'd begged for help. Could I have saved him? If I'd warned him, would he still be alive? The thought haunted me. As the clock struck midnight, I made a decision. I couldn't ignore the watch any longer. If it was showing me these things, there had to be a reason. I didn't know how, but I was going to try to save someone, even if it killed me. The night passed in restless silence, my thoughts racing as the weight of my decision pressed down on me. If the pocket watch was showing me death, then it was also offering a chance to intervene. But how? Was I supposed to walk up to strangers and tell them their life was about to end? The next morning, I held the watch in my hand as I left my apartment. Its cracked face glinted faintly in the sunlight, a grim reminder of the task ahead. My plan, or rather, my lack of one, was simple. Wait for the next vision and figure it out from there. I found myself at a local cafe, sitting by the window with a coffee I wasn't drinking. The place was busy, filled with the low hum of chatter and the clinking of mugs. I scanned the room, trying to keep my nerves in check. And then I saw her. A young woman, probably in her mid-20s, sat 2 tables away. She had auburn hair tied back in a messy bun and was engrossed in her laptop. To anyone else, she seemed completely ordinary. But when I glanced at her from the corner of my eye, her face shifted. Her eyes became hollow and lifeless, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her mouth gaped open in that same haunting scream. I froze, the blood draining from my face. It was happening again. For a moment, I couldn't move. My hands trembled, and my chest tightened as I struggled to breathe. But then I forced myself to look at her directly. She was normal again. The watch in my pocket felt like it was burning against my leg. I had no idea how to approach her. What was I supposed to say? "Hi. I think you're going to die soon because my cursed pocket watch told me so." But I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I stood up and walked over to her table. She looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "Hi," I said, my voice shaky. I know this is going to sound strange, but I think you might be in danger. Her brow furrowed. Excuse me? I know it sounds crazy, but please, just listen. I have this feeling that something bad is going to happen to you. She stared at me, her expression shifting from confusion to suspicion. Is this some kind of joke? Because if it is, it's not funny. No, it's not a joke, I said quickly. I'm serious. Please, just be careful today. Watch where you go and don't take any unnecessary risks. Her eyes narrowed. Look, I don't know who you are, but this is really weird. Please leave me alone. I opened my mouth to say more, but the words wouldn't come. The tension in her voice, the way her hands clenched the edge of the table, I was scaring her. Defeated, I backed away and returned to my seat. She packed up her things and left a few minutes later, glancing over her shoulder as she went. I spent the rest of the day pacing my apartment, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. Had I done enough? Should I have tried harder to convince her? The answer came the next morning when I turned on the news. Local woman injured in a freak accident, the anchor said. My stomach sank as a photo of the woman from the cafe appeared on the screen. The report said she'd been walking downtown when a construction site accident sent debris falling onto the sidewalk. She'd suffered serious injuries but was expected to recover. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. The watch's warning had been real. I hadn't stopped it, but she was alive. For now. The incident at the cafe solidified my resolve. I couldn't sit back and ignore the watch's warnings, but I also couldn't keep stumbling blindly through this. I needed a plan. I spent the next few days researching everything I could about the watch, about curses, and about the concept of precognition. Most of it was nonsense, urban legends and pseudoscience, but a few pieces of information stood out. One article described objects imbued with death echoes, residual energy from traumatic events that allowed them to predict similar occurrences. Another mentioned family heirlooms cursed to protect their lineages in strange and twisted ways. None of it gave me concrete answers, but it was enough to fuel my determination. A week later, I was back at the store, trying to go about my day as normally as possible. But normal had become a foreign concept. I was ringing up a customer when I saw him. A teenager, maybe 18 or 19, was browsing the shelves near the back of the store. He wore a hoodie and jeans, his hands shoved into his pockets. And then it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, his face shifted. His skin turned pale, his eyes hollow, his mouth gaping open in that horrible scream. I clenched my jaw, willing myself to stay calm. "Excuse me," I said to the customer in front of me. "I'll be right back." I approached the teenager slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey," I said, "can I help you find something?" He looked up, startled. His face was normal again, but I could still feel the weight of the vision pressing down on me. "No, I'm good," he said. "Are you sure? You look distracted." He frowned. "I'm fine. Thanks." But I wasn't fine. The watch's warning was clear, and I couldn't ignore it. After he left the store, I decided to follow him. It felt wrong, stalkerish even, but I couldn't let another warning slip through my fingers. He walked down the street, his pace casual, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing around him. I kept my distance, my heart pounding with every step. After a few blocks, he turned into an alley. My pulse quickened as I followed, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The alley was empty, save for a few dumpsters and some scattered trash. The teenager was leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone. I hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Then, without thinking, I called out to him. "Hey!" He looked up, startled. "Listen," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to explain this, but I think something bad is going to happen to you." He stared at me, his expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. "Okay, weirdo," he said. "What's your deal?" "I know it sounds crazy, but please, just trust me. Be careful. Stay away from..." Before I could finish, a loud crash echoed through the alley. A delivery truck had swerved into the narrow space, its brakes squealing as it came to a stop inches from the teenager. He stumbled back, his face pale, his phone clattering to the ground. For a moment, we both stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. The driver jumped out of the truck, shouting apologies and explanations about faulty brakes, but I barely heard him. The teenager turned to me, his eyes wide with shock. "How did you—" he began, but the words trailed off. I didn't answer. I just turned and walked away, the weight of the watch heavy in my pocket. That night I couldn't sleep. The teenager was safe, but at what cost? I had crossed a line, interfering in someone else's life in a way that felt intrusive and wrong. But if I hadn't— I stared at the watch, its cracked face catching the light from my bedside lamp. It felt like it was mocking me, daring me to keep going. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. All I knew was that I couldn't stop now. The watch wouldn't let me. The events of the alley left me shaken. I had saved the teenager's life. There was no question about that. But the cost of my intervention weighed heavily on me. I was crossing a line, stepping into the role of a savior, or perhaps something more sinister. The watch wasn't just showing me death, it was binding me to it. That night, I sat in my darkened apartment, staring at the watch. Its cracked face gleamed faintly under the dim light of the lamp. The longer I stared, the more it seemed to pull at something deep inside me. I couldn't keep doing this alone. I spent the next morning combing through my father's old belongings, hoping to find some clue about the watch. His antique shop had been packed up after his death, the items stored in a small unit on the edge of town. The unit smelled of dust and time, a mix of old wood and forgotten history. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, labeled in Dad's neat handwriting. After hours of searching, I found a small leather-bound journal tucked beneath a pile of faded documents. My father's handwriting filled the pages, neat and deliberate. The journal detailed his encounters with the watch. "The watch is a cruel gift," he had written. "It shows death, not as a warning, but as an inevitability. I tried to save them. I thought I could outsmart fate, but the cost was always higher than I could bear." The entries grew darker as they went on, filled with stories of failed attempts to intervene and the guilt that followed. "I don't know why the watch came to me," he had written, "but I know this. It isn't a tool for salvation. It's a mirror, reflecting the inescapable." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. My father's words were a warning, but they offered no answers. As I drove home, my mind raced. Was my father right? Was the watch simply showing me the inevitable? I was lost in thought when it happened again. At a red light, I glanced at the crosswalk and saw a woman with a stroller waiting to cross. She looked like any other mother, her attention focused on her child. But in my periphery, she was something else entirely. Her skin was pallid and stretched, her eyes dark and hollow. The stroller sat empty, its wheels bent at strange angles. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The light turned green, but I couldn't move. "Go!" someone honked behind me. I shook myself and drove through the intersection, pulling over a block away. My heart pounded as I tried to decide what to do. I ran back to the intersection, searching for the woman. She was still there, waiting for the light to change. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to catch my breath. She looked at me, startled. "Yes?" "I know this sounds strange, but please, be careful crossing the street. There's been an accident nearby." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" I fumbled for words, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. "Just trust me. Wait until the next light, okay?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. The light changed and cars surged forward. I watched, my stomach in knots, as a speeding truck ran the red light, barreling through the intersection where she would have been. She gasped, clutching the stroller tightly. "Oh my God," she whispered, turning to me. "How did you know?" I didn't answer. I just walked away. The incident with the woman left me shaken, but it also brought a strange sense of validation. I could make a difference. But the watch wasn't finished with me. A week later, I was back at work when I saw him. A man in his 30s was browsing the shelves, his movements slow and deliberate. At first, he seemed normal, but when I glanced at him from the corner of my eye, his face twisted into the now familiar scream. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Excuse me," I said, approaching him. He looked up, surprised. "Yes?" My voice faltered. I didn't know how to explain. "Are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "I think you might be in danger," I blurted out. He stared at me, confused. "What are you talking about?" I hesitated, the weight of my father's warnings pressing down on me. But I couldn't stay silent. "Just be careful today," I said. He shook his head and walked away, muttering something under his breath. That evening, I saw his face on the news. He had been involved in a fatal car accident on his way home. I sat on my couch, my hands trembling. I had tried to warn him, but it wasn't enough. My father's words echoed in my mind. The watch isn't a tool for salvation. It's a mirror reflecting the inescapable. Had I done the right thing? Or was I just delaying the inevitable? As the days passed, I became more determined to understand the watch. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between guilt and fear. I returned to the journal, searching for anything I might have missed. One entry stood out. The watch shows death, but it doesn't choose the moment. The cracks in its face are the key. They distort the truth, making it impossible to see clearly. The cracks. I held the watch up to the light, examining the fractured surface. The lines seemed to shift and shimmer, almost alive. Was it possible that the watch wasn't showing me the future, but rather a twisted version of it? I couldn't ignore the watch's warnings, but I also couldn't keep living like this. I needed help. Someone who could make sense of the watch and its curse. I reached out to an old friend, a historian who specialized in antiquities. If anyone could help me unravel the mystery, it was her. Her name was Elena, and she agreed to meet me the next day. As I sat in my apartment that night, the watch resting on the table in front of me, I felt a strange sense of hope. Maybe there was a way to break the curse. Maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to escape the watch's grip. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. The watch wasn't just a tool. It was something far more sinister. And it wasn't going to let me go without a fight. The morning of my meeting with Elena dawned heavy and gray, clouds gathering like silent witnesses to what felt like the most crucial day of my life. I held the pocket watch in my hand, its cracked face glinting faintly as if mocking my desperation. My father's journal was tucked under my arm. Elena and I met at a small cafe near the university where she taught. The place smelled of fresh coffee and pastries, but the warmth of the ambiance did little to ease the cold knot in my stomach. "Jeremy," Elena said, her warm smile fading as she saw the tension in my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I placed the watch on the table between us. "Not a ghost," I said, my voice low. "Something worse." Elena listened intently as I recounted everything. The visions, the alley, the woman at the crosswalk, and the man who had ignored my warning. I laid my father's journal before her, showing her the entries about his struggles with the watch. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed. "This is extraordinary," she said, "and terrifying. Tell me you've seen something like this before," I pleaded. "Tell me there's a way to stop it." She hesitated, running her fingers over the journal's worn leather cover. "Objects like this aren't unheard of, but they're rare. Cursed artifacts are usually tied to intense emotions, grief, anger, guilt. Your father might not have known the full extent of what he was passing down." "Can it be destroyed?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not in any way that would break the curse. Destroying the object might only trap the curse permanently, leaving it unresolved. So what do I do? Elena leaned forward, her voice low. If the watch is tied to death, it's possible it wants something. Understanding its purpose might be the only way to break free. As Elena and I spoke, the watch grew heavier in my pocket, as though it was listening. We were walking back to her office when it happened again. A man was jogging along the sidewalk, his earbuds in, oblivious to the world around him. In my periphery, he appeared hunched and broken, his head lolling unnaturally. "Elena?" I whispered, my voice tight. She followed my gaze, but her expression remained blank. "I don't see anything," she said. The jogger reached a crosswalk, the light green for pedestrians. But I saw the danger, a speeding car running the red light, its driver distracted by a phone. "Stop!" I shouted, running toward the jogger. He yanked out an earbud, startled, but froze as the car screeched through the intersection. "Jesus!" he exclaimed, stepping back. "Thanks, man." I nodded, my hands shaking. Elena was silent as we returned to her office. Once inside, she pulled out a stack of books on folklore and cursed objects. "What do these visions have in common?" she asked. I thought about it. They all involve death, and they only happen when the watch is with me. "Then the watch isn't just showing you death," she said. "It's tethering you to it." "But why?" I pulled out the journal again, flipping through the pages. My father's words echoed in my mind. The watch isn't a tool for salvation. It's a mirror, reflecting the inescapable. "It's not just a mirror," I said. "It's a test." Elena looked at me, her eyes sharp. "A test of what?" "Of whether I can change what it shows, but every time I intervene, something worse happens." As we spoke, the air in the room grew heavy, a strange pressure building. I pulled out the watch, its face more cracked than ever. The vision came without warning. Elena, standing by her desk, was suddenly transformed. Her skin was gray, her eyes sunken and lifeless. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, her hands clutching at her throat. "No!" I shouted, staggering back. "What is it?" Elena asked, alarmed. "It's you," I said, my voice shaking. You're next." She went pale, but her expression hardened. "Then we have to act quickly. What does the watch want?" We laid the watch on her desk, surrounding it with the books and notes we had gathered. Elena chanted softly in Latin, her voice steady as she invoked every protective ritual she knew. The watch began to glow faintly, its cracks pulsing with an otherworldly light. The air in the room grew colder, and I felt a presence, something ancient and malevolent. "Jeremy," Elena said, her voice trembling. "It's reacting to you. Speak to it." I swallowed hard, my fear threatening to choke me. "What do you want?" I demanded. The light intensified, and a voice echoed in my mind. "To be seen, to be known." The watch showed me one final vision. Elena's lifeless body slumped over her desk, and my own reflection in a cracked mirror, my eyes hollow and dead. "I won't let this happen," I said through gritted teeth. The voice responded, "You cannot stop what is already written." "No," I said, "I can change it." The glow of the watch grew blinding, and the presence pressed down on me, almost unbearable. Elena shouted something, her voice distant, and the room seemed to implode. When the light faded, the watch lay shattered on the desk, its pieces scattered like fragments of a broken life. Elena and I were both alive, though shaken. "What happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "You made the choice," Elena said. "You rejected its power. The curse is broken." I looked at the broken watch, its malevolence gone. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted, but the cost lingered. The memories of those I had seen and failed to save would stay with me forever. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rebuild my life. I returned the journal to the storage unit, leaving it as a record of what had been. Elena and I stayed in touch, our bond strengthened by what we had endured. The visions were gone, but the lessons remained. Death was inevitable, but life was about the choices we made along the way. As I walked through the streets of my city, I felt a strange sense of peace. The watch had been a curse, but it had also been a teacher, and now, finally, I was free. Hi there, my name's Toby, and I want to tell you about something that happened to me when I was 12. It's a story that still makes me shiver whenever I think about it. It's about the day something really scary happened at my school just before Christmas. Back then, I was in the 7th grade. My best friend was a kid named Finn. Finn was smart and always cracking jokes, even if they got him in trouble sometimes. He had shaggy blonde hair, wore glasses, and loved video games more than anything. We both did, actually. That year, we couldn't stop talking about this new World War II video game we were dying to play over the holidays. We had spent weeks planning how we'd meet up and play it non-stop once school let out. Our teacher that year was Mr. Jensen. He was a kind man who loved telling us stories about history. He wore these tweed jackets that made him look like he stepped out of a black and white movie, and he always had this calm, patient vibe. But that calmness would soon be tested in a way none of us could have expected. It was the last day of school before Christmas break. The halls were buzzing with excitement because, well, who doesn't love Christmas? The teachers were in good spirits too. Miss Lawson, the math teacher, wore a bright red sweater with a huge reindeer on it, complete with a blinking red nose. Even grumpy old Mr. Patterson, who taught science, had loosened up enough to let us watch a holiday movie during class. That afternoon, after lunch, Finn and I were sitting in geography class. Our classroom was on the 2nd floor, and our desks were right next to a big window overlooking the schoolyard. Finn was doodling in his notebook while we talked quietly about our holiday plans. The schoolyard below was empty because everyone was in their classes. It was a quiet gray day, with clouds heavy in the sky. While Finn was talking about how he was going to get the highest score in our new game, something caught my eye in the schoolyard. A man had walked into the yard. He looked out of place. He was wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, and his boots left muddy tracks behind him. At first, I thought he might be one of the janitors, or maybe a delivery guy. But something about him made me look twice. He stopped walking and started looking around, like he didn't know where he was. "Finn," I whispered, nudging him. "Look at that guy down there." Finn turned to the window and squinted. "Weird. Do you think he's lost or something?" "Maybe," I said, but I couldn't take my eyes off the man. He wasn't moving anymore. Instead, he stood completely still and stared up at the sky. We both started giggling, trying to figure out what he was doing. Finn made a joke about him waiting for Santa to land, and we laughed so hard our teacher, Mr. Jensen, gave us a look to quiet down. But when I glanced back out the window, the man was still there, staring at the clouds. Then, everything changed. Our French teacher, Miss Reed, walked out of the teacher's lounge, which was in the corner of the schoolyard. She was carrying a stack of papers, probably heading to her classroom. Miss Reed was strict and didn't put up with nonsense. If someone was in the yard without permission, she'd sort it out. At first, she didn't seem to notice the man, but as she walked past him, he suddenly turned and looked right at her. It wasn't just a casual glance. It was sharp, like he'd been waiting for her to show up. Miss Reed stopped in her tracks. We could see her face from the window, and even from up there, I could tell she was nervous. The man started walking toward her, and then I saw what he had in his hand. It was a hammer. My heart started pounding. Finn grabbed my arm. "What's he doing?" Miss Reed backed away slowly. The man lifted the hammer above his head and started shouting something we couldn't hear through the glass. She dropped her papers and ran back toward the teacher's lounge, her long coat flapping behind her. The man chased her. By now, the whole class had noticed. Kids were getting up from their seats to see what was happening. Mr. Jensen told us to sit back down, but no one listened. We watched as Miss Reed barely made it into the teacher's lounge before slamming the door behind her. The man banged on it with the hammer, over and over, shouting so loudly we could hear him now. Mr. Jensen acted fast. He told us to stay put and ran out of the room to lock the doors to our building. But the fear had already spread. Kids started crying and huddling together. Finn and I stayed by the window, unable to look away. The man didn't get into the teacher's lounge. Instead, he turned and started walking toward our building. We heard the sound of smashing glass a few minutes later. He had broken a window downstairs. When Mr. Jensen came back, his face was pale. He told us to move the desks and chairs to block the classroom door. Finn and I pushed as hard as we could, stacking furniture while some kids just froze in fear. Mr. Jensen kept us calm, saying the police were on their way, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Then we heard footsteps on the stairs. The man reached our floor and started banging on the classroom door. His face appeared in the little window, wild and angry. His eyes were so wide it looked like he hadn't slept in days. He started hitting the door with his hammer, trying to break it down. Some of the girls screamed. Finn grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. The hammer kept pounding, and I thought the door would give way any second. But then we heard shouting from downstairs. The police had arrived. It took a few minutes, but the man was finally caught. The police took him away, and we were all told to stay in our classroom until it was safe. Later, we found out that the man had been going through a terrible time in his life and had just snapped. It's sad to think about, but that day could have ended very differently if it weren't for Mr. Jensen's quick thinking and the police arriving in time. I'll never forget that Christmas. It was supposed to be a happy time, but instead it became the scariest day of my life. Finn and I still talk about it sometimes, even now. We always say how lucky we were to have a teacher like Mr. Jensen looking out for us. And that's why, every Christmas, I take a moment to be thankful, not just for presents or fun, but for the people who keep us safe when things go wrong. My name is Logan, and when I was 13, I had the most terrifying experience of my life. It all started one summer when I went to visit my grandpa, Elijah, in the dense, untamed forests of northern Montana. Grandpa Eli had lived there for decades in a creaky old cabin filled with stories of strange things he'd seen in the woods. He was a wiry man with a long silver beard and twinkling eyes that hid a lifetime of adventures. "Logan," he'd always say, "the forest has its secrets. You just have to listen." I'd shrug it off, thinking he was just trying to scare me into staying close to the cabin. My best friend Sawyer had come along with me for the trip. Sawyer was the kind of kid who could make a game out of anything, and he wasn't afraid of anything. He had curly blonde hair and a gap-toothed grin that made him look younger than he was. Grandpa gave us a list of rules on our first day. Always stick together. Never go out after sunset. If you smell something really awful, rotten and sour, get out of the woods immediately. Sawyer and I laughed. "What's gonna happen, Grandpa? Bigfoot gonna get us?" Sawyer teased. Grandpa's face darkened. "The Grublin," he said in a low voice. "The what?" I asked, half laughing. "The Grublin," Grandpa repeated. "It's not a bear, not a wolf, not anything you've seen before. It's bigger, dumber, and meaner than any animal out here. And if you smell it, it's already too close." Sawyer rolled his eyes, but I felt a little shiver. Grandpa wasn't joking. A few days later, we decided to explore the woods near a dried-up creek. Sawyer wanted to test out his new camping gear. He had a shiny silver compass, a flashlight that could light up the whole forest, and even a survival whistle. I wasn't as prepared. I just had my backpack with a water bottle, some snacks, and a map Grandpa had drawn for us. We wandered deeper than we should have. The trees grew thicker, their branches knitting together to block out the sunlight. We climbed over fallen logs and poked at the muddy ground with sticks, pretending we were treasure hunters. By the time we realized how far we'd gone, the sun was already sinking low in the sky. "We should head back," I said, my voice shaky. Sawyer waved me off. "We're fine. Let's just check out that hill over there, and then we'll go back." Reluctantly, I followed. That's when we smelled it. At first it was faint, like wet garbage left in the sun. Then it grew stronger, a thick, choking stench of decay and skunk and something worse. My stomach twisted and I gagged. Ugh, what is that? Sawyer covered his nose with his sleeve. Maybe a dead animal? I suggested, though I didn't believe it. We froze when we heard the sound. A heavy snuffling, like a giant animal sniffing the ground. It was close. Too close. My heart thudded in my chest as I grabbed Sawyer's arm. We need to go, I whispered. Sawyer nodded, his grin finally gone. We turned to head back the way we came, but a low, rumbling growl stopped us in our tracks. Slowly we turned around. Standing in the shadows of the trees was something. It wasn't a bear, but it was as big as one. Its fur was patchy and matted, hanging off its huge muscular body in clumps. Its head was long and strange, like a mix between a sloth and a wolf, with glowing yellow eyes that stared right at us. Its front legs were massive, ending in paws the size of dinner plates, with claws that gleamed like knives. I couldn't breathe. It took a step closer, its claws crunching on the dry leaves, and that awful smell hit us like a wave. Sawyer did the dumbest thing he could have done. He pulled out his whistle and blew it as hard as he could. The sound echoed through the forest, high and sharp. The creature, Grandpa's Grublin, reared back on its hind legs, standing taller than anything I'd ever seen. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Sawyer's arm and pulling him as fast as I could. We crashed through the forest, branches whipping at our faces. Behind us, I could hear the Grublin barreling after us, its growls shaking the air. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they'd explode, but I didn't dare stop. The Grublin let out a strange, guttural sound, almost like it was laughing. "We're not gonna make it," Sawyer yelled, his voice breaking. "Yes, we are," I shouted back, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Suddenly, I remembered Grandpa's third rule. If you smell it, it's already too close. I yanked Sawyer off the path and shoved him behind a thick tree trunk. "Climb," I hissed, and we scrambled up the tree as fast as we could. The Grublin stomped into the clearing below us, sniffing the air. Up close, it was even more horrifying. Its fur was crawling with bugs, and its drooling jaws were full of jagged, broken teeth. It moved in jerky, clumsy steps, but it was terrifyingly strong, swiping at trees and snapping branches like twigs. Sawyer and I clung to the tree, holding our breath. The Grublin sniffed around, grunting and growling. For a moment I thought it would leave, but then it looked up. Its glowing eyes locked onto ours, and it let out a deafening roar. I don't remember much of what happened next. I remember Sawyer throwing his flashlight down to distract it. I remember the Grublin smashing the flashlight to pieces with a swipe of its claws. And I remember Grandpa's voice, far away but clear as a bell. "Logan, Sawyer, get down!" Grandpa burst into the clearing, holding his old hunting rifle. He fired a shot into the air, and the Grublin roared again, this time in anger. But it didn't charge. Instead, it turned and lumbered back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Grandpa didn't say a word as he helped us down from the tree. He just handed us each a canteen of water and pointed back toward the cabin. That night, we sat around the fireplace, still shaking. Grandpa finally broke the silence. "You boys saw it, didn't you?" We nodded. Grandpa sighed. "You were lucky. Most folks who meet the Grublin don't make it back." Sawyer and I didn't sleep that night, and even now, years later, I can still smell that awful stench in my nightmares. Grandpa was right. Some secrets of the forest are better left alone. And if you ever go wandering in the woods, remember this. If you smell something awful, run. The night had always held a certain tranquility for me. Calm, serene, almost comforting in its stillness. The sort of stillness that permeates the air and sinks deep into your bones. reminding you of the silence that has always been, the silence that is never truly broken. But tonight was different. Tonight, the night seemed heavier, thicker, as though something unspoken hovered just beyond the edges of my awareness. I could feel it, just out of reach, like a breath held too long, waiting to be exhaled. It made my skin prickle and my heart beat just a little faster than usual. I adjusted the worn baseball cap on my head and tugged my jacket tighter around me as I began my usual evening walk around the property. Bosley padded along beside me, his steady steps a comfort in the overwhelming quiet. The dog had been my constant companion for years now, and I had grown to depend on him for more than just companionship. In this lonely, desolate place, Bosley was my anchor, my protector. The air was crisp with the bite of early autumn, the coolness a relief from the oppressive humidity of the summer months. The farm stretched out around me, rolling hills dotted with scattered barns, old fences creaking in the wind, the distant outline of the house sitting at the center of it all. My eyes drifted over the fields, the shadows of the crops stretching long in the twilight, but the sight no longer held the same charm it once had. Since Maria's death, the farm felt different. The sense of life, of warmth, that had filled the house with her laughter and energy was gone. What remained was an overwhelming silence that felt too loud at times, as though the land itself mourned her absence. Bosley snorted softly, breaking me from my thoughts, his nose twitching as he picked up a scent on the breeze. I glanced down at him, his golden coat glowing faintly in the dim light, his ears pricked forward, alert. He was always attentive to the world around us, ever watchful. I trusted him implicitly. If there was anything out of place, I knew he'd notice long before I did. We continued our walk, the familiar path stretching ahead of us, winding around the back of the house. I found solace in the routine of it all. The rhythmic sound of my boots crunching on the gravel, the occasional rustling of leaves underfoot, and Bosley's steady presence at my side. It was a quiet comfort, one that allowed me to push back against the grief that had settled into the very marrow of my bones since Maria's passing. But tonight, something was different. I felt it before I saw it. A subtle shift in the air, a change in the way the darkness seemed to cling to the house. It was as though the shadows had deepened. The night had grown thicker, denser, and the world around me had become more watchful. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I instinctively stopped, scanning the familiar landscape. My eyes narrowed in the direction of the house, drawn by a faint flicker of movement that caught my attention. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a reflection from one of the windows perhaps, or the swaying of a tree outside. But as I squinted into the growing darkness, I saw it again. A shadow. A figure. It was fleeting, just a brief glimpse through the second-story window of the house, the one that overlooked the bedroom where Maria and I had once shared our dreams. The window was large, with shutters that creaked in the wind, but the shadow I saw was not that of the tree branches or any passing cloud. No, this shadow moved with purpose, with intention, and for a moment, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Bosley growled low in his throat, his hackles raised, the sound of his deep, rumbling growl sending a chill down my spine. I glanced down at him, his eyes gleaming with unease as he stared toward the house, his posture tense, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Something was wrong. I could feel it now, the unmistakable presence of something, or someone, that didn't belong. I swallowed hard, a knot forming in the pit of my stomach. My pulse quickened, and the comforting stillness of the night seemed to close in on me, suffocating in its weight. I wanted to turn and leave, to retreat into the safety of the barn or the distant fields, away from the house and whatever had stirred within it. But I couldn't. The instinct to protect, to defend what was mine, pushed me forward. I had to know. Taking a slow, steady breath, I began walking toward the house, my boots crunching noisily on the gravel path. Bosley stayed close, his growls soft but persistent as we approached the front porch. The air was colder here, the darkness even more oppressive. I could barely make out the details of the house, its once cheerful facade now appearing dark and looming, like a watchful, brooding entity. I stopped at the foot of the steps, staring up at the second-story window where I had seen the shadow. The curtains were drawn now and the house was as still as a tomb. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching, just beyond the edge of my perception. My breath fogged in the cold air as I stepped up onto the porch, my mind racing with questions. Who could be there? What had I just seen? Maria, I whispered under my breath, the name escaping me without thought. I had to stop myself. I couldn't allow myself to fall into that trap again. The grief, the longing, it was all too much, and I had no place for it anymore. Maria was gone, and the house, despite its familiar warmth, was no longer a place of refuge. Bosley's growl grew louder as we stood there, his body stiff with tension. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the result of too much isolation and too many long nights spent alone. The grief had a way of distorting reality, making everything feel more intense, more real than it really was. But as I turned to leave, the soft sound of a creak from upstairs stopped me in my tracks. I froze again, my heart hammering in my chest. That sound, it hadn't been the wind. The floorboards in the second-story bedroom above me had just creaked. I was sure of it. Someone was up there. But who? The shadows seemed to deepen as I stood there, the oppressive silence stretching between each beat of my heart. Bosley's growl turned into a low whine, his eyes wide as he stared at the door, unwilling to approach it any further. "Stay here, boy," I whispered, my voice barely audible as I made my way slowly up the stairs. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob, the wood smooth under my fingers. I hesitated, listening for any sounds that might indicate movement inside. Nothing. Just the wind, the creaking of the house, and the relentless beat of my own pulse. With a sharp intake of breath, I pushed the door open. The living room stretched out before me, dark and empty. The flickering light of the single lamp on the far wall cast long shadows across the floor. But everything was still. Too still. I glanced back over my shoulder at the window, my gaze lingering there for a moment before I finally turned away, my footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. I knew I couldn't keep pretending nothing was wrong. Something had changed in this house, something I couldn't ignore any longer. I had to get to the bottom of it, whatever it was. As I made my way toward the staircase, I looked back one final time. The night outside seemed even darker now, a heavy weight pressing against the walls of the house. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the full force of my loneliness. Bosley's low growl followed me as I ascended to the second floor, the eerie tension between us palpable in the silence that stretched on. Something was watching from the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before it made itself known. The second floor of the house was colder than I expected. The warmth of the evening had dissipated completely, leaving only the chill of the autumn night to seep through the old walls. I paused at the top of the stairs, my breath fogging in the air as I listened, trying to make sense of the strange feeling that had taken root in the pit of my stomach. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my boots seemed amplified in the silence, each one adding another layer to the mounting tension that weighed on me. I glanced at the bedroom door, the one that Maria and I had shared for so many years, the one that had once been filled with laughter, love, and dreams of a future that now seemed so far out of reach. The door was slightly ajar, the gap just wide enough for me to glimpse the faint outline of the furniture inside, shadowed and unmoving. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand resting on the banister, torn between the desire to turn and run and the need to confront whatever was lurking in the dark corners of this house. Bosley was still beside me, his presence a silent reassurance. But even he seemed unsettled, his body tense, his ears flicking toward every little sound. I could feel his discomfort. Something wasn't right. I hesitated for another moment before I pushed open the bedroom door. The hinges creaked loudly, and I winced at the sound. The room was as still as a tomb, the heavy curtains drawn tight, blocking any trace of the moonlight that had bathed the outside world in its eerie glow. The air was thick with dust, untouched by time, just as I had left it when I had sealed myself away in the grief of losing Maria. The bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled, just like every night we had shared it. My fingers hovered over the surface of the bed, almost afraid to touch it, as if the very act of disturbing the room would shatter the delicate illusion of Maria's presence that still lingered in the space. But it wasn't Maria's presence I felt now. It was something else. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I took a step further into the room, my gaze flickering to the far corner where Maria's vanity stood. The mirror, once framed with delicate carvings, was covered in dust, the reflection of the room distorted and warped in its surface. I hadn't come up here in months, but I had made a habit of avoiding the room completely. It felt too haunted. Maria's absence was so pronounced in this space that it was as though her spirit had taken up residence here, refusing to leave. I couldn't breathe. The stillness pressed in on me, the absence of sound so profound that it felt suffocating. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it, a shadow, fleeting and subtle, moving across the opposite wall. It was barely perceptible, but it was there, and my heart stopped. I froze, my pulse quickening as I looked around the room. My eyes darted to every corner, scanning for any sign of movement, anything that might explain what I had just seen. But there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive stillness that seemed to mock my every attempt to make sense of it. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and turned toward the door. But as my hand reached for the handle, I heard it, a soft creak, the unmistakable sound of someone shifting their weight on the floor above. My heart leaped in my chest, and I stiffened. Someone was here. But who? My mind raced, the dread and confusion swirling inside me like a storm. I had to know. I had to confront whoever was in this house. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that I could just lock myself away in this empty shell of a home and forget about the darkness that had crept into every corner of my life. With a trembling breath, I stepped out into the hallway, my footsteps light but steady. Bosley was close behind me, his eyes trained on the shadows, his body taut with tension. I knew he was as unsure of what was happening as I was, but we both understood that we had to keep moving. There was no turning back now. I followed the sound of the creaking floorboards, my heart hammering in my chest as I moved toward the staircase. I reached the top of the stairs and paused, my ears straining to hear any further sounds. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My hand gripped the banister, knuckles white, as I slowly descended the stairs. I had barely taken 3 steps when I heard it. A soft whisper, like the rustling of fabric against skin. It came from the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat, and my stomach twisted into a tight knot. The kitchen was just beyond the hallway, a darkened space where I had spent countless hours with Maria, preparing meals and sharing quiet conversations. It was a room that had always felt alive, warm with the scent of cooking, filled with the sounds of clinking dishes and laughter. But now, it felt like a tomb. I had not set foot in there since Maria's death, and yet it was calling me, pulling me toward it like a magnet. The whispering, soft and insistent, seemed to echo in the silence of the house, making the walls feel as though they were closing in around me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I took another step toward the kitchen. Bosley's growl rumbled from deep in his throat, a low, warning sound that chilled me to the bone. Whatever was in there, he could sense it too. I reached for the doorframe, my fingers brushing against the cold wood. It felt strange, too cold for a place I had always associated with warmth and comfort. The kitchen, once so familiar, was now alien to me. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was darker than I had expected, the shadows in the corners almost thick enough to touch. The stove, once gleaming with use, sat silent and abandoned. The table in the center of the room, where Maria and I had shared many a quiet meal, was now covered in dust, untouched for months. But it wasn't the stillness that made my skin crawl. It was the faint, acrid smell that lingered in the air, like something had decayed, something that didn't belong. Then, just beyond the table, I saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the dim light. My breath caught, my pulse racing. The figure was tall and gaunt, draped in tattered clothing, its face hidden in the shadows. I could feel its gaze, though, cold, piercing, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The air around it seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, a tension that made the hairs on my neck stand straight. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence in the room grew thick, suffocating, as I took an instinctive step back. But as I did, the figure moved. It was slow, deliberate, almost unnatural in its grace. It stepped forward, its feet making no sound on the floor, and then, in a voice that was little more than a whisper, it spoke. "You're not alone." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. My stomach twisted violently, and my hands went numb. The figure stepped closer, its presence filling the room like a shadow that refused to fade. It reached out with a long, thin hand, its fingers cold and unfeeling. I recoiled instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest, but it didn't touch me. Instead, it let its hand hover just inches from my face, its fingers twitching as though it was testing the air between us. "Maria is gone," it whispered again, its voice raspy and hollow. "But you are still here, and so am I." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. I was trapped in the room with this thing. And then, as if sensing my panic, it began to fade, slipping back into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The last thing I saw before it disappeared was its eyes, dark and endless, like two pools of ink, staring into me as if they could see everything I had buried deep inside. I stumbled back, my legs weak, my mind reeling. The kitchen was silent once again, the figure gone as though it had never existed at all. But the words it had spoken, they echoed in my mind. "You're not alone." Maria was gone, but whatever had appeared in this house was not, and it wasn't going anywhere. I turned and ran back toward the front door, my pulse thundering in my ears. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. The house was no longer a place of refuge. It was a prison. And whatever was here, waiting in the dark, was not going to let me go without a fight. I didn't stop running until I was outside the house, the cool night air slapping against my skin like a brutal reminder of the reality I could no longer escape. Bosley barked in frantic alarm as I stumbled across the porch and down the steps, my breath ragged and uneven. The full moon, hidden behind thick clouds, cast an eerie glow over the farm, illuminating the land in strange, ghostly light. My mind was spinning, my heart still racing in my chest. The kitchen was silent now, too silent, but the echoes of the figure's presence reverberated through my every step. The words it had whispered echoed in my mind like a cruel chant, repeating over and over, reverberating through the dark corners of my mind. "You're not alone." The chill that had gripped me in the kitchen now seemed to follow me, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me with every breath. I couldn't stay in the house, not anymore. I glanced back at the front door, its outline barely visible in the darkness. The house loomed behind me, towering and oppressive, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. I felt as if I were being drawn into something I could not escape, something darker, something more powerful than I could comprehend. A slow, creeping terror had taken root in me, burrowing deeper with every passing second. Whatever had been in that kitchen was not something I could simply dismiss. It was real, undeniable, and it was not alone. I turned away from the house, focusing instead on the large barn in the distance. It stood like a monument to my past, my work, my memories with Maria, the place where we had once shared so many late nights, sorting through harvests and planning for the future. It had been a sanctuary, a place of peace. But tonight, it felt like nothing more than another dark corner of the world waiting to swallow me whole. "Bosley," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. The dog trotted beside me, his usual confidence replaced by an uneasy hesitation. His eyes darted to the shadows, his tail tucked low between his legs. Even he sensed the change. The barn door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound jarring in the dead silence of the night. The interior was dimly lit, the weak moonlight filtering through cracks in the wooden walls. The familiar scent of hay and timber filled the air, but even here, I could feel it. An undeniable shift in the atmosphere, a presence that lingered like smoke in the corners of the barn. I stepped further inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. Bosley remained close, his movements hesitant as he sniffed the air. I reached the far corner of the barn, my eyes scanning the room as I tried to force my mind to focus. There had to be an explanation for what I had seen, for what I had felt. Perhaps it was the stress, the isolation, the weight of grief pressing down on me until my mind started to play tricks. Maybe I had imagined it all, the shadow in the kitchen, the whispering voice. The logical part of me wanted to believe that, but something in my gut told me that I was far from imagining things. The barn was still, its silence almost suffocating. Yet it felt like the world around me had gone completely quiet, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I placed my hands on my hips and exhaled slowly, trying to steady my racing heart. The warmth of the barn seemed to do little to alleviate the cold dread settling deep inside me. Suddenly, Bosley's head shot up, his ears perked forward. He stood absolutely still, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the door at the far end of the barn. My breath caught in my throat as I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, not at first. Then, I saw it. A shadow, darting across the far wall. It was quick, fleeting, but unmistakable. The same movement I had seen earlier in the house, only this time, it was more pronounced, more deliberate. My pulse quickened again, and I instinctively took a step back. Bosley's growl rumbled deep in his chest, a low guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the barn. His body was stiff with tension, his tail rigid, his fur standing on end. "Bosley," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper, but he didn't respond. He was fixated on the shadow, his hackles raised, his mouth open in a silent snarl. I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising panic that clawed at my throat. This wasn't right. I had to confront it. I reached for the flashlight I kept in my pocket and flicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. The barn was bathed in its harsh light, and for a brief moment, everything seemed normal. But the unsettling feeling did not subside. The shadows clung to the edges of the barn, warping and shifting unnaturally, as though something in the very fabric of the air was out of place. I moved slowly toward the source of the movement, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of the flashlight bounced erratically in my trembling hands as I swept it over the barn's rafters and the piles of old hay. Nothing. The space was empty, but the tension remained. I turned back to Bosley, but the dog was no longer growling. He stood at the entrance, looking at me with eyes wide with fear, his body frozen in place. His stance was one of submission, his tail low to the ground. It was unlike him, and the sight sent a chill down my spine. "Come here, boy," I said, my voice firm but gentle, hoping to coax him closer. But Bosley remained where he was, staring into the darkened doorway. Something was wrong. I could feel it, pressing against my skin, crawling into my bones. Without thinking, I moved toward the door, my hand tightening around the flashlight. The barn door groaned under the pressure as I pushed it open, the sound sending a shudder through me. The wind was stronger now, the night colder, and the sky above me was clouded, casting everything in a muted gray light. The land stretched out before me, the familiar contours of the farm now obscured by shadows that seemed to move and shift. I took a step outside, scanning the fields. The trees that lined the edge of the property were still, their branches swaying gently in the wind, but they too seemed to be watching, their gnarled limbs twisting like twisted fingers reaching toward the sky. The night felt wrong. Every sound seemed too loud, too sharp. The wind, the rustling of leaves, even the far-off hoot of an owl, all of it felt like a warning, a prelude to something darker, something worse. Suddenly I heard a sound behind me, a scraping noise, the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the ground. My heart lurched in my chest as I spun around, the flashlight beam swinging wildly. It landed on the barn door. A figure was standing there, the same figure I had seen in the kitchen. It was silhouetted in the doorway, its outline vague and indistinct, as though the shadow itself had taken form. It was tall, almost impossibly so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body, stretching at odd angles. Its face was hidden in the dark, but the absence of light where its eyes should have been made it seem even more unnerving. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from the figure. And then, it spoke. Its voice was a rasping whisper, like something that had been dragged out of the depths of the earth. "I've been waiting for you." The words seemed to settle around me like dust, heavy and suffocating. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and I staggered backward, my mind racing for an explanation, for anything that could make sense of what was happening. But nothing came. The figure remained still, its presence pressing in on me, suffocating in its intensity. Bosley barked in warning from behind me, his voice sharp and frantic, but I barely registered it. My mind was fixated on the figure in front of me, a sensation of dread creeping up my spine, its fingers wrapping around my throat, squeezing the air from my lungs. "Maria is gone," the figure said, its voice softer now, but no less chilling. "But you remain." I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, my chest heavy with fear. There was something wrong with the air, with everything, and I couldn't fight it anymore. Whatever this was, whatever it had been, was here for me. The figure stepped forward, its long, spindly limbs shifting in the darkness. I could feel it closing in on me, its presence like a black hole, pulling everything into it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The air was still once more. I was left alone, standing in the moonlight, trembling from head to toe. The land was silent again, as though nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. Whatever it was still here, and it was only a matter of time before it returned. I stood alone in the yard, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my legs unsteady beneath me. The air felt wrong, thick, suffocating, as if the night itself had turned hostile. The shadows were longer, more pronounced, as though they were stretching toward me, reaching for me with unseen fingers. The memory of the figure that had vanished into the darkness still lingered, a cold, oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen to the spot, but eventually, the dread that gripped me loosened its hold, and I stumbled back toward the barn. I couldn't stay out here, not with that thing, or whatever it was, lingering just beyond the edges of my mind. I had to get inside. I had to lock the doors, seal myself in, and hope to God that whatever had been haunting me would stay away. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. The barn door creaked open with a groan as I pushed it back, and Bosley trotted in after me, his tail low, his eyes wide with fear. He gave a soft whine as he padded toward me, pressing his body against my legs in a silent plea for reassurance. I scratched behind his ears absently, my mind elsewhere, my heart still hammering in my chest. The barn felt different now. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. The same unease that had gripped me earlier returned with a vengeance, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. It was as though the barn itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My hand shook as I ran it through my hair, my mind replaying the words the figure had whispered to me. Maria is gone, but you remain. What did that mean? Why had it said that? Maria had been gone for nearly a year now. Her sudden death, so sudden and violent, had shattered my world in ways I couldn't even begin to explain. She'd been my partner, my best friend, the one person I could count on. And now, she was gone. Just like that. But that didn't explain why this thing, this shadowy figure, was haunting me. It was as if Maria's death had somehow opened a door to something dark and twisted that I couldn't understand. I shook my head, trying to clear away the thoughts that were spiraling out of control. I couldn't afford to lose myself in grief and fear. Not now. I turned away from the barn's interior and made my way toward the house. The porch creaked underfoot as I stepped onto it, the door hanging slightly ajar. I had left it that way in my rush earlier, but now, as I looked at it, I felt a renewed sense of dread. The air inside the house was stagnant, cold despite the warmth of the day that had long since passed. I hesitated at the doorway, my eyes scanning the interior, searching for any sign of movement. The silence was deafening. But then, just as I was about to step inside, I heard it. A soft sound, like something dragging across the floor. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly stepped inside, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. The house seemed to stretch out before me, its rooms dark and empty, a shell of what it once was. The memory of Maria's laughter, her warmth, her presence, lingered in the walls, but it was quickly being replaced by something darker, more sinister. The dragging sound came again, louder this time, echoing through the hallway. It was coming from upstairs. I didn't want to go up there. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me toward it, an unshakable compulsion that I couldn't ignore. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move, my footsteps slow and deliberate as I made my way toward the stairs. With every step, the house seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. The sound of dragging grew louder, closer, until it was right above me, just out of sight. I reached the top of the stairs and stood there for a moment, staring down the long hallway. The door to Maria's old bedroom was slightly ajar, a sliver of light leaking through the crack. That's where the sound was coming from. I walked toward it, my breath catching in my throat. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the room beyond. And there it was. The figure. It stood at the foot of the bed, its back to me. Its limbs were impossibly long, stretched out in grotesque angles that made my stomach churn. It was draped in shadows, its features obscured by the dark, but I could feel its presence, feel it like a weight on my chest. It didn't move at first. It simply stood there, waiting, as if it knew I was watching. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I took a step forward, the floorboards creaking beneath me. And then, it turned. Its face was nothing. No eyes, no nose, just a hollow void where its features should have been. A black, swirling mass, like the deepest abyss, filled the space where its face should have been. The emptiness within it sucked the air from the room, making it hard to breathe, to think, to move. And then, it spoke. "You should have left when you had the chance," it said, its voice a low, raspy whisper that sent a chill down my spine. The words were like a poison, curling around my mind, making it impossible to think clearly. I staggered back, my legs trembling beneath me, but the figure didn't move toward me. It just stood there, watching me with its empty face, its presence suffocating in the stillness of the room. "Leave now. It's too late." The words echoed in my mind, a warning, a command. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, consume me. With a burst of adrenaline, I turned and fled down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps loud in my ears as I stumbled toward the stairs. But before I could make it to the landing, I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A voice. It wasn't the thing's voice. This was different. It was softer, gentler. It was Maria's voice. "Don't go," it whispered. I froze. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, everything went still. The house, the figure, the coldness. It all disappeared, replaced by the warm, familiar sound of Maria's voice. It was as if she were standing right there, calling out to me. But I knew better than to listen. I knew better than to believe that voice. I snapped my head back toward the staircase, and the figure was there, standing at the bottom of the stairs, its long limbs stretching out toward me, its presence suffocating. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Without another thought, I turned and bolted out of the house, through the door and into the yard. The air felt fresh, the night cool against my skin, but the terror still clung to me like a shadow. Bosley was by my side again, his eyes wide, his body tense. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I could feel it, feel the figure in the distance, lurking just beyond the edge of the property, watching me, waiting. And then, the silence broke. A sound, like footsteps, echoed from the darkened house. It wasn't a trick of the wind, nor the creaking of the old wood. Someone, or something, was walking through the house, and it was coming for me. The footsteps grew louder. They echoed through the yard, slow and deliberate, each one carrying a weight that pressed down on my chest like a vice. I spun around, my eyes scanning the dimly lit landscape, my heart pounding in my ears. The house stood behind me, silent now, its windows darkened, as if it were holding its breath along with me. But the air had changed. It was heavier, thick with something I couldn't place. Something malignant that clawed at my skin, prickling like static electricity. My eyes darted toward the front door, now wide open, and I swore I saw something. Someone move in the shadows just beyond the threshold. No. My feet moved before my mind could catch up, carrying me toward the edge of the yard, away from the looming threat of the house. But as I took another step, I froze. The figure, the one I had seen in the house, in the barn, was standing there, at the edge of the yard, just beyond the faint glow of the porch light. It was still, but its presence was undeniable, like a shadow stretched across the world. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It hadn't moved, not physically, but its sheer weight seemed to push the air around me, pressing in, suffocating me. And then, it spoke. "Run." The words were simple, soft, but they carried an edge of finality that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. The figure's voice, hollow, unearthly, cut through the night like a blade. Its tone wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was a command. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to get as far away from it as possible. But something rooted me to the spot. Something deep inside me was calling out, demanding that I face whatever this was, whatever it wanted. I swallowed, my throat dry, my mouth a desert. My legs felt like lead, unwilling to move, but I forced myself to take a step forward. The figure's shape shifted in the darkness, blurring for a moment, and then it was closer, too close, standing just a few feet away, its long limbs stretched impossibly, its dark silhouette now almost tangible, like a living shadow. But there were no eyes, no face, nothing but the absence of everything. I could feel its presence like a suffocating weight, like the air had become a thick fog that I couldn't breathe through. The figure's voice was a soft murmur, barely above a whisper. "She's waiting for you." I stumbled back, my chest tightening, my mind a whirlpool of confusion and fear. "She's waiting for you." Who? I didn't have time to answer. My head spun with too many thoughts, too many questions. But as I glanced back at the house, something stopped me cold. There, in the doorway, stood Maria. Her silhouette was faint, like a ghost in the moonlight, but it was unmistakable. Her hair, once dark and flowing, now hung limp and tangled around her face. Her form was fragile, ethereal, and she seemed to be waiting for me, calling me with an expression of quiet desperation. "Maria?" I choked out, my voice barely a whisper, hoarse from the tension in my throat. She didn't speak. She just stood there, motionless, as if she were waiting for me to come to her. Her figure shimmered in and out of focus, and I could feel the weight of her gaze on me, though her eyes were hidden in the shadows. I reached out, but my hand faltered in midair, trembling. There was something wrong, so much wrong. The figure behind me seemed to move, its long, spindly limbs twisting in unnatural ways, shifting and contorting like liquid shadows. My pulse hammered in my ears, my mind racing, torn between the urge to run and the impossible pull of Maria's figure. "Don't go to her," the voice of the figure said, its words a sharp, warning hiss. I froze again, the words digging into my mind like a splinter lodged under my skin. What was happening? Was this Maria? Was it really her? The figure stepped forward, a long, skeletal arm reaching out, its hand brushing against my shoulder, sending an icy chill through me. "Run," it repeated, its voice rasping in my ear like the wind through dead trees. "She's not what you think. None of this is real." The world around me seemed to shift. The house behind me blurred, its walls bending like the fabric of reality was unraveling. My vision wavered, the landscape of the yard stretching and distorting, and for a split second, I thought I saw the trees bend, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The air turned cold, biting, suffocating. Maria's figure remained, but now it was wrong. Her form flickered, like a distorted reflection in a cracked mirror. Her features seemed to blur and twist, the once familiar outline of her face warping into something unrecognizable. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, were hollow, black voids that seemed to absorb the light around them. The hair that had once framed her face now floated around her like tattered rags in the wind, twisting unnaturally. It wasn't Maria. It couldn't be. The figure behind me let out a low, mournful sound, a guttural noise that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I felt its grip tighten on my shoulder, the coldness seeping into my skin, and I gasped, stumbling away from the touch. My heart was racing, my mind a mess of disjointed thoughts, struggling to make sense of what was happening. But the more I looked at the figure in front of me, the more I realized that this was not just some apparition. This was something real, something ancient, malevolent, and far more powerful than I could comprehend. It wasn't here for me. It wasn't just watching. It was in control. Maria's face twisted again, her lips curling into a sickening smile that made my blood run cold. The world around me seemed to tilt, and I couldn't catch my breath. This wasn't real. The figure spoke again, its voice echoing in my mind, reverberating in the air like the hum of electricity. She was never yours to keep. You never let her go. But now she's mine. All of this, it was never meant to be. And neither are you. The words struck me like a physical blow, my chest constricting painfully as I fought to keep my footing. The world around me swirled, a vortex of darkness, light and sound. And then, in the center of it all, there was a door. A black door standing alone in the middle of the yard. It wasn't there before. It was a door unlike anything I had ever seen, made of blackened wood, jagged and twisted, as though it had been ripped from some other place, some other time. Its edges were frayed, raw, as though it had been torn apart and rebuilt over and over. And there, in the middle of it, stood a small window, shattered. Behind the glass, I could see something moving, something dark and terrible, swirling like a storm in the void. The figure behind me stepped forward again, its long, crooked limbs stretching out. Its face, if it could be called a face, remained a blank void, a shadow of nothingness. But the pressure of its presence was suffocating. I could feel it pulling at my mind, twisting it, trying to force me to look away from the door. It's not real. None of this is real. But the more I resisted, the more the door seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing, waiting for me to step through. Without thinking, my body moved on its own. My legs carried me forward, toward the door, each step heavier than the last. The figure, Maria, was no longer in the yard. The air was still, eerily so, as I approached the door. I didn't want to go through it. I knew I shouldn't. But my hand reached out, trembling to grasp the handle. And then, everything went black. The world was nothing but darkness. There was no ground beneath my feet, no sky above, only an endless void that stretched into infinity. I couldn't see my hands, couldn't feel my body, but I knew I was there, suspended in some other place, some limbo between life and death, between sanity and madness. I tried to move, to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the abyss. I felt a coldness creeping into my bones, a deep, hollow chill that gnawed at my very soul. The weight of it was unbearable, like the pressure of 1,000 hands pushing down on me. And then, I saw it. A faint glimmer of light, a flicker in the distance, like a star struggling to stay alive in the void. It was small at first, barely perceptible, but it grew brighter as I focused on it, pulling me toward it, drawing me in. I didn't want to go, but I had no choice. The light became brighter, more intense, until it surrounded me entirely, its warmth beginning to seep into the cold that had taken hold of me. The darkness receded, and slowly, the void was replaced with something more familiar, something I couldn't quite place at first. But then I saw it. The house. I was back. I stood on the porch, looking at the old farmhouse, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. The night was still, unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. The air was thick with the same sense of dread that had hung over me before, and I could feel the weight of something ancient and malignant pressing in from all sides. But it wasn't just the house that had returned. I saw her, Maria. She stood at the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the light inside. Her face was the same as I remembered, soft, warm, alive. But as I took a step forward, something shifted. Her form wavered, like a reflection in a cracked mirror, her features distorting into something unfamiliar. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, now looked hollow, sunken. black as the void I had just escaped. I stopped in my tracks. This wasn't Maria. It couldn't be. She smiled, a slow, twisted grin that made my blood run cold. Her lips curled back, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too inhuman. "You've finally come," she whispered, her voice a low, guttural rasp that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to scream. I wanted to turn and run. But my feet were rooted to the spot, as if some unseen force was holding me there, forcing me to watch, to listen. "Why?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper, trembling with fear. "Why are you doing this?" The thing that had once been Maria stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if her body was not entirely her own. "You should have left when you had the chance," she said, her voice echoing in my mind like a whisper in the wind. "But you stayed, and now it's too late." My heart thudded painfully in my chest, the words sinking into my brain like poison. I had stayed. I had refused to leave, thinking that I could face whatever haunted this place, thinking that I could outrun it. But now I understood. It had never been Maria who was haunting me. It had been something else, something that had followed me, fed on my grief, my guilt, my fear. It had been waiting for me to break. And now, it had me. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, the world tilting as if reality itself was bending and warping around me. The trees that lined the yard twisted and bent into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching toward me like gnarled fingers. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I gasped for breath, feeling the weight of it pressing against my lungs. "You've let it in," the voice of Maria, if it could even be called that, echoed again, louder this time, reverberating in the very air around me. "You've let it in, and now it's here. It's inside of you." My stomach twisted with nausea, the words sinking in like a blade into my gut. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just Maria. It had been inside of me all along, growing, feeding off my fear, my grief, my endless sorrow. It had twisted my reality, warped my memories, and now it was here to claim me. "No!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "I won't let you have me! I won't!" The figure that had once been Maria tilted her head, a mocking smile playing on her lips. "You've already given up," she said. "You just don't know it yet." I shook my head, my mind reeling, trying to fight back against the despair that threatened to overwhelm me. But the more I resisted, the stronger the pressure became. The darkness began to creep in from all sides, filling every corner of the yard, every inch of the house. It was closing in on me, suffocating me, and I could feel the walls of reality crumbling, disintegrating, until all that was left was the endless void. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a sound cut through the darkness. Bosley. His bark echoed across the yard, sharp and filled with urgency. I spun around, my heart skipping a beat as I saw him standing at the edge of the yard. He was alive, his fur ruffled by the wind, his eyes wide and alert. And behind him, something even more surprising. The door. The door that had appeared earlier in the void. It stood at the far edge of the yard, glowing with a faint light, as if it were the last remnant of something pure, something good. I didn't hesitate. With all the strength I could muster, I ran toward Bosley, my feet pounding against the earth, my body moving on pure instinct. The dark figure of Maria was behind me, its presence pushing at my back, but I refused to look. I refused to give in. I had to reach the door. Bosley barked again, urging me on, his form growing closer as I neared the edge of the yard. I could see the door now, fully illuminated, its wooden frame strong and unyielding, the shattered glass in the window like a broken promise. And then, just as I reached the door, I heard it. The voice. It was Maria's voice. but it was no longer the mocking, twisted thing it had been before. It was soft now, gentle, like the voice I remembered from our life together. "Don't go," she whispered. "Don't leave me." I stopped in my tracks, my hand hovering just above the door's handle. The weight of her words pressed down on me, and for a moment I felt the tug of her presence again, the pull of something lost, something I couldn't bear to leave behind. But then I saw it. Beyond the door, in the faint light that seeped through the cracks, there was a figure. Maria. Her form was whole, complete, and radiant with life. She stood at the far side of the door, her eyes filled with love, warmth, and understanding. "Maria?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She smiled, her eyes soft with the love I had once known. "You have to let me go," she said. "You have to let me go, David." And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't Maria. It was a lie, a trick, a cruel reflection of the love I had lost. The real Maria, the one I had lost to death, would never ask me to stay in this place, in this twisted nightmare. She would want me to live. She would want me to move on. With a deep, shuddering breath, I reached for the handle and pushed the door open. The world collapsed around me. I stepped through the doorway into the light, and as I did, the darkness fell away. The house crumbled to dust, and the cold weight that had pressed against my chest vanished. The last remnants of the nightmare were gone, dissipating like smoke in the wind, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe again. Bosley bounded ahead of me, his tail wagging, his eyes bright with the joy of freedom. And as I looked back at the wreckage of the house, I felt a weight lift from my soul. The torment was over. The darkness had been vanquished. The door closed behind me, and with it, the last remnants of the nightmare. I was free. When I was 11 years old, my family moved to a small town in Ohio. It was a quiet place with long streets lined by big oak trees, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. My parents had found a house that was too good to pass up, a 2-story home on Maple Street with 5 bedrooms and a big backyard. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously cheap. My dad, Eric, was a handyman, and my mom, Carla, worked part-time at the local library. They figured the price was low because the house was old. I didn't think much of it at first. My little sister, Lila, and I were excited because we finally got our own rooms. Lila was 7 years old, full of energy, and loved playing dress-up. She was always prancing around in her princess costumes. The landlords lived downstairs in a separate part of the house. Their names were Mr. and Mrs. Granger. Mr. Granger was a retired carpenter, and Mrs. Granger was a quiet, bird-like woman who always wore a thick sweater, no matter the weather. They had a son named Roy who came around sometimes to help them with house repairs. At first, the Grangers seemed nice. Mrs. Granger would smile at us whenever we saw her in the yard, and Mr. Granger would wave from his workbench in their garage. They even brought us a plate of cookies when we first moved in. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Mrs. Granger had said in her thin, shaky voice. But soon, things started to feel strange. One afternoon, I was in my room drawing when I heard a soft knock at the door. It wasn't unusual for Lila to come barging in, so I thought nothing of it. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Lila. It was Mrs. Granger. "Do you know how to keep secrets?" she asked out of nowhere, her voice barely a whisper. Her watery blue eyes stared right into mine. I froze. I guess." She nodded slowly and walked back downstairs without another word. When I told my mom about it later, she shrugged it off. "Maybe she's just lonely," she said. A week passed and things got weirder. There was a door at the bottom of the stairs that connected our part of the house to the Grangers' downstairs unit. It was always locked, and my parents told us not to mess with it. One day, While playing hide and seek with Lila, I accidentally pushed on the door, and to my surprise, it creaked open. The smell hit me first, something sour and musty. I peeked inside and realized the door opened right into the Grangers' living room. There was no wall, no separation. I quickly shut the door and told Lila the game was over. That night, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps. At first, I thought it was Lila sneaking around, but when I looked out into the hallway, no one was there. The next morning, I found my sketchbook open on my desk, even though I'd put it in my drawer before going to bed. "Lila, did you go into my room last night?" I asked at breakfast. She shook her head, her mouth full of cereal. "Nope." My parents brushed it off as me forgetting where I left it. A few nights later, I was home alone. Mom and Dad had taken Lila to a school event, and I was supposed to finish my homework. As I sat at the kitchen table, I heard a soft click. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I got up and looked down the hallway. The door at the bottom of the stairs was slightly open. I could see a shadow moving on the other side. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. Suddenly, Mrs. Granger appeared in the doorway. She didn't say anything, just stared at me with those same watery blue eyes. I slammed the door shut and locked it. After that, things escalated. Every time we left the house, we came back to find things moved around. My mom's coffee mug would be on the table instead of in the sink. Lila's toys would be scattered across the floor. Once, my bedspread was folded into a perfect square. My parents thought we were imagining things. "You're just adjusting to a new place," Dad said. But I knew better. One morning, I woke up to the sound of water running. I went to the bathroom and found the floor completely soaked. The sink faucet was on full blast. Lila stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Why'd you turn the water on?" I asked her. "I didn't," she mumbled. Later that day, Mrs. Granger came upstairs, banging on the door. She accused us of flooding her bathroom. "This is your fault," she screamed. My mom tried to calm her down, but Mrs. Granger wouldn't stop yelling. Mr. Granger came out and pulled her away, mumbling something about letting it go. The final straw came when we woke up one morning, and the stairs to the front door were gone. Just gone. My dad went outside to find the steps dismantled and sitting on the Granger's porch. When he confronted Mr. Granger, the old man just said, "We're fixing them. Use the back door for now." That night I heard Roy arguing with his parents downstairs. His voice was loud and angry, but I couldn't make out the words. Then I heard the sound of something heavy falling, followed by silence. We didn't stay much longer after that. My parents didn't want to admit it, but they were scared too. One night we packed up as much as we could and left without telling the Grangers. We moved to a different town and never looked back. But sometimes, I still think about that house on Maple Street. I wonder what the Grangers were hiding, and I wonder if anyone lives there now.